Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I've replayed that question over and over since arriving in this forgotten town. My name is Michael Reed, at least that's what my press badge says. I'm a journalist with the Tribune, sent to investigate the peculiar disappearances in Oakwood Valley, a place so small it barely registers on most maps. The town sprawls beneath perpetually gray skies, nestled between mountains that seem to lean inward, as if eavesdropping on the community below. Victorian-era buildings line the main street, their paint peeling like old scabs. An unusual silence permeates everything, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. My first interview was with Sheriff Thomas Lowry, a man with deep-set eyes and knuckles that bore scars from fights he claimed never happened. His office smelled of stale coffee and something else I couldn't place, something earthy and damp. 7 people gone in 8 months, he explained, spreading photos across his desk. No connection between them except they all lived here. No signs of struggle. Just gone. As he spoke, the ceiling fan above us cast spinning shadows across the room. For a moment, I could swear one shadow moved independently of the others, stretching toward me like an inquisitive finger. You feeling all right? The sheriff's voice snapped me back. Just tired from the drive, I lied. When I left the station, a heaviness followed me. The weight of being watched pressed against my back, but each time I turned, the street remained empty. Just shop windows with mannequins whose plastic eyes seemed to track my movement. I checked into the Pinewood Motel, a 2-story structure with peeling wallpaper and floors that creaked whether you stepped on them or not. The clerk handed me a key, an actual metal key, not a card, attached to a wooden tag marked 7. Lucky 7, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My room faced the woods behind the motel. As dusk settled, I unpacked my laptop and recorder, arranging my notes on the small desk. The radiator hissed, pumping tepid air into the room. I began typing my initial impressions when the gentle tapping started. 3 soft knocks, like fingernails against glass. I looked to the window, expecting to see a branch scratching the pane, but nothing was there. Just darkness punctuated by the distant yellow glow of the motel sign. The tapping came again, this time from the bathroom door. I froze, fingers hovering above my keyboard. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but shadows. Hello? My voice sounded thin, foreign. I rose slowly, crossed the room, and pushed the door open. Empty. Just a shower curtain drawn closed across the tub. With trembling fingers, I pulled the curtain back. Nothing but cracked porcelain and a slow-dripping faucet. That night, I dreamed of faceless figures standing at the foot of my bed, watching. I awoke at 3:17 according to the glowing red digits of the alarm clock, my sheets damp with sweat, and a peculiar realization I couldn't recall my mother's name. I reached for my phone to call her, to prove to myself that this momentary lapse was just fatigue, but as I scrolled through my contacts, I found no entry for Mom or any name that sparked recognition. The panic that followed was like electricity coursing through my veins. I fumbled for my wallet, searching for anything, a photo, an old note that might jog my memory. But even as I searched, other details began slipping away. My childhood street address, my first pet's name, where I went to college. I grabbed my notebook and frantically wrote down everything I could still remember about myself. My name, my age, my assignment, the disappearances. The pen stilled in my hand as I realized something. Each person who vanished in Oakwood Valley had first been reported acting strangely, forgetting things, basic things. Outside my window, a shadow shifted against the tree line. Not the movement of branches and wind, there was no wind that night, but something deliberate, something watching. I stepped to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass, straining to see into the darkness. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. And then it was gone, leaving nothing but the impression of having been observed with terrible intensity. I returned to my notes, but found myself staring at an empty page. The words I'd written moments before had vanished. Or perhaps I'd never written them at all. What was I doing in this room? What was this town called? And more disturbingly, what was my name again? The morning light filtered reluctantly through the thin motel curtains, rousing me from a sleep that felt more like drowning. Fragments of my identity returned as consciousness took hold. Michael Reed, journalist, investigating disappearances, but other parts remained frustratingly blank, like words erased from a chalkboard, leaving only the faintest dust outline. I showered quickly, the water running cold after 3 minutes. As steam filled the bathroom, I could have sworn I saw handprints appear on the mirror, larger than human hands should be, with elongated fingers. But when I wiped the condensation away, nothing remained. My recorder sat on the bedside table, and I pressed play, hoping yesterday's interview with Sheriff Lowry might refresh my memory. Static filled the room. 10 minutes of white noise where his voice should have been. At the very end, barely audible beneath the hiss, "Do you feel it watching you yet?" I nearly dropped the device. Had the sheriff actually said that, or was my mind playing tricks? I rewound and played it again. This time, nothing but static. I needed coffee. Strong, black coffee to clear my head. The diner across from the motel, Early Bird, was nearly empty at 8 in the morning. A waitress with a name tag reading Ellie poured coffee without my asking. Her fingers trembled slightly, spilling drops onto the Formica table. "You're the reporter," she said. Not a question. "Yes. I'm looking into the disappearances." She glanced nervously toward the windows. "You shouldn't be." "Why not?" "It notices people who notice it." She set the coffee pot down with a clatter. "You're staying in room 7, aren't you?" The question sent an inexplicable chill through me. "How did you know that?" "They all stayed there. Before." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Once it starts taking your memories, you don't have long." "What starts taking them?" "Who's it?" Her eyes darted to something behind me, and she straightened abruptly. "Your eggs will be right up," she said loudly, then hurried away. I turned, half expecting to see someone there, but found only an empty booth. Through the window, though, I noticed a man standing across the street, perfectly still amid the morning bustle. He wore a gray suit that seemed to blend into the overcast sky, and though I couldn't make out his features clearly at that distance, I had the distinct impression he was staring directly at me. I blinked, and he was gone. After breakfast, I visited the local library to research the town's history. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, watched me suspiciously as I requested archives of the local newspaper. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, her voice carrying in the empty building. "Patterns." previous disappearances, unusual events, anything that might connect to what's happening now. She studied me for a long moment before nodding toward a microfilm machine in the corner. Start with 1973, the year of the flood. The microfilms revealed a disturbing pattern. Every 27 years, Oakwood Valley experienced a surge in disappearances. In 1973, it was after a flash flood that nearly destroyed the town. In 2000, it followed the renovation of the old church on Pine Street. And now, in 2027, it began after they drained Miller's Pond to build a new shopping center. But more disturbing than the pattern was what I found in a small article from 1973. A photograph showed rescue workers standing beside the swollen creek, and in the background, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, a tall, thin figure, its face blurred beyond recognition, standing among the trees. The same figure I thought I'd seen outside my window. The microfilm machine whirred as I zoomed in, trying to get a clearer image. The photograph grew grainier, the figure more distorted, until it resembled nothing more than a smudge. When I looked up from the machine, Margaret stood watching me, much closer than she had been moments before. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice oddly flat. "Maybe. Do you remember the flood of '73? She nodded slowly. "I lost my husband that year. Not to the flood. He just walked into the woods one day. Said he kept seeing someone watching him from the trees." She leaned forward, her breath smelling of peppermint and something medicinal. "He said he kept forgetting things, too. Little things at first. Then big things. The day before he disappeared, he couldn't remember my name." I felt a coldness spread through my chest. "Did they ever find him?" "No. But sometimes, I feel him watching me." Her eyes, roomy with age, held mine. "Just like it's watching you now." I turned instinctively, but the library remained empty. When I looked back, Margaret had moved several feet away, reshelving books as if our conversation had never happened. Outside, the afternoon had grown unnaturally dark, heavy clouds promising rain. I walked quickly toward the sheriff's office, needing to confront him about the voice on my recorder. As I passed an alley, movement caught my eye, a figure retreating deeper into the shadows. Without thinking, I followed. The alley narrowed between brick buildings, dampness seeping from the walls. Puddles reflected the darkening sky, and each step I took echoed strangely, as if someone were walking in perfect sync behind me. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice bounced back, distorted. "Who's there? Who's there?" At the alley's end stood a door, weathered and gray, with no handle or knob, just a tarnished brass plate where one should be. Without understanding why, I knew this door was important. I approached slowly, heart thundering in my chest. As I reached for the brass plate, my phone rang, shrill in the confined space. I jumped, fumbling to answer it. "Hello?" Silence, then a voice I recognized as Sheriff Lowry's. "Where are you right now?" "An alley off Main Street." "There's a door here. Get out of there." His voice cracked with urgency. "Now. Don't look back. Don't stop. Come straight to my office." "Why?" "What's?" "It's chosen you." The line went dead. I turned to leave and froze. At the alley entrance, silhouetted against the gray light of the street beyond, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its proportions subtly wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, pale oval where features should be. And though it had no eyes, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was watching me. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, carrying me toward the handleless door. My shoulder hit it hard, pain lancing through me, but the door didn't budge. I pushed, kicked, threw myself against it repeatedly as the figure began to move, gliding toward me with unnatural smoothness. The brass plate beneath my desperate fingers suddenly depressed with a click, and the door swung inward. I tumbled through into darkness, slamming it shut behind me. In pitch blackness, I fumbled for my phone to use as a light. The screen illuminated a small, empty room with concrete walls. No other doors. No windows. Just bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, all dark. I tried to call Sheriff Lowry back, but found no service. As I lowered the phone, its light caught something scratched into the wall. IT takes your name last. Below this, a list of names had been carved, each one crossed out. At the bottom, still uncrossed, Michael Reed. My name. And I realized with dawning horror that I couldn't remember what my mother looked like, or the name of the newspaper I worked for, or why I had come to this town in the first place. Something scratched gently at the door behind me. The scratching grew more insistent. A sound like fingernails, too many fingernails, dragging across the wooden door. My phone's flashlight flickered, the battery indicator blinking red. I backed away until I hit the opposite wall, eyes fixed on the door, certain that at any moment it would swing open. Instead, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete I could hear blood rushing in my ears. Then a voice spoke, not from beyond the door, but somehow inside my own head. Michael Reed, it whispered, each syllable like ice water trickling down my spine. I see you. The overhead bulbs suddenly blazed to life, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I found myself not in the concrete room, but standing in the middle of the town's cemetery. Daylight streamed through the trees, casting dappled shadows across weathered headstones. The transition had been instantaneous, without any sensation of movement. Had I imagined the room? The door? The figure in the alley? My phone showed 3 hours had passed since I'd entered the alley. 3 hours unaccounted for. I stumbled between graves, disoriented, until a particular headstone caught my eye. Freshly carved marble, gleaming white against the older, lichen-covered stones surrounding it. The name made my heart stutter. Michael Reed, 1990. The day of death remained uncarved, waiting. My legs gave way, and I sank to the damp earth before the stone. I touched the carved letters of my name, feeling the sharp edges against my fingertips. Real. Undeniably real. They always come here eventually, said a voice behind me. I whirled to find a man in his 60s, leaning on a shovel. The groundskeeper, presumably, though he wore a tweed jacket more suited to a professor than a gravedigger. Who put this here? I demanded, gesturing to the headstone. He shrugged. Been here long as I can remember. Thought it was strange, having a stone without a death date. He eyed me curiously. You're him, aren't you? The reporter asking questions about the missing folks? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then you should talk to Evelyn White. She's the only one who ever came back. He pointed toward a small cottage visible at the edge of the cemetery. Lives there. Hasn't spoken a word since they found her wandering in the woods 27 years ago, but she writes. Pages and pages. 27 years, I repeated. The pattern again. The groundskeeper's expression darkened. Stay away from the woods after dark. And if you start forgetting things. He trailed off, then thrust the shovel into the soft ground with unnecessary force. Well, just keep writing things down. Evelyn White's cottage smelled of lavender and dust. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes registered neither surprise nor interest when I introduced myself, but she gestured for me to enter. The walls of her living room were covered with pages, hundreds of them, pinned in overlapping layers. Drawings mostly, rendered in black ink with obsessive detail. They all depicted variations of the same figure, tall, thin, faceless. Sometimes standing among trees, sometimes in a room that looked like this very cottage, sometimes bending over a sleeping form. You've seen it too, I breathed. Evelyn nodded. She retrieved a notebook from a drawer and wrote in precise handwriting, "It wants to be remembered." The entity? That's why it takes memories. She wrote again, not takes. Replaces. A chill spread through me. Replaces with what? Itself. She turned to a bookshelf and pulled down a photo album. Inside were photographs of Evelyn with a man and a young girl, presumably her husband and daughter. In each successive photo, the husband grew increasingly blurred, as if he were moving when the picture was taken. In the final photos, where he should have been standing, there was only a tall, indistinct shadow. Evelyn pointed to the shadow, then to herself, then made a slashing motion across her throat. "It's coming for you next," I translated. She shook her head vehemently and wrote, "Already had me." I escaped. "Coming for you. How did you escape?" Her hand trembled as she wrote, "I gave it someone else." Understanding dawned horribly. "You sacrificed your husband." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. She wrote one more sentence, pressing so hard the pen tore through the paper. I can hear it in the walls again. As if on cue, a faint scratching sound emanated from behind the wallpaper. Evelyn's eyes widened in terror. She rushed to the door and flung it open, pushing me outside with surprising strength. Before closing the door, she pressed a folded paper into my hand. I stood on her porch, listening to the sound of furniture being dragged against the door. When I unfolded the paper, I found a detailed drawing of the handleless door I'd encountered in the alley, along with what appeared to be instructions. "Full moon midnight mirror, speak your name until you forget it." Tonight was the full moon. The sun was already setting as I made my way back into town. Street lamps flickered on, pools of yellow light in the gathering dusk. Each shadow seemed to stretch toward me as I passed, and more than once I spun around, certain someone was following. I returned to the motel, locking the door and drawing the curtains tight. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked haggard, eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to think clearly. When I looked up, something dark moved in the mirror behind my reflection, just for an instant, a tall shape shifting in the corner of the room. I whirled around, but the room was empty. My hands shook as I checked my notes, trying to piece together everything I'd learned. The 27-year cycle. The flood, the church renovation, the draining of Miller's Pond. Disturbances that awoke something old and hungry. And now it was awake again, and it had chosen me. I wrote my name on the motel notepad. Michael Reed. Then my birth date, my parents' names, the name of my first pet, a cat called Pepper, and every other personal detail I could still remember. Already, some memories felt foggy, indistinct. I couldn't recall the color of my childhood bedroom or the face of my college roommate. As darkness claimed the sky outside, I prepared for midnight. I placed a bathroom mirror on the desk facing the bed. I'd follow Evelyn's cryptic instructions. What choice did I have? At 11:30, someone knocked on my door. Mr. Reed? Sheriff Lowry. Need to speak with you. I approached cautiously. What about? Found something about the disappearances. Something you need to see. I peered through the peephole. Sheriff Lowry stood in the hallway, looking anxious but normal. Just a minute, I called, then whispered to myself, Michael Reed, testing my memory of my own name. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Sheriff? I stepped outside, glancing both ways. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun and grabbed the handle, but it was locked, my key inside. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the end of the hallway, a tall, thin figure slipping around the corner. Sheriff? I called again, advancing slowly. I rounded the corner into the stairwell and stopped cold. Standing on the landing between floors was not Sheriff Lowry, but the faceless entity. Up close, its wrongness was even more apparent, limbs too long, torso too narrow, skin like paper stretched over nothing. Where its face should have been, the smooth surface rippled, as if something beneath were trying to push through. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It extended one elongated hand toward me, fingers unfurling like petals. And suddenly, inexplicably, I took a step toward it, drawn by an impulse I couldn't name. It wanted me to touch it. It wanted to touch me. And some part of me wanted that too, longed for it with an intensity that frightened me more than the entity itself. My foot hit something that clattered, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. The sound broke whatever spell had taken hold, and I grabbed the extinguisher, ripping it from its bracket and discharging it directly at the entity. White chemical powder engulfed the figure. It made no sound, but the air seemed to vibrate with its rage. I ran, clattering down the stairs and out into the night, the entity's silent fury pulsing behind me like a physical force. Outside, the full moon hung low and swollen in the sky. I checked my watch, 11:45. 15 minutes until midnight. Without my room key, without the mirror, what could I do? The answer came as I spotted my own reflection in a puddle, the lake. Miller's Pond, now nearly dry after being drained for construction. A natural mirror beneath the full moon. I ran toward the edge of town, toward the construction site, aware with every footfall that I was being pursued. Not by sound or sight, but by the crawling sensation of being watched, the pressure of attention so focused it felt like a hand against my back. What was my name again? The thought bubbled up unbidden. Michael, something. Mitchell? No, Michael. Michael Reed. Michael Reed, I gasped as I ran. Michael Reed, Michael Reed. But even as I repeated it, I felt the syllables growing foreign in my mouth, becoming just meaningless sounds. The construction site loomed ahead, moon-washed and skeletal. Chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, topped with barbed wire. Signs warned, and no trespassing. Danger. Keep out. I found a section where the fence had been cut, the edges curled back to create a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. Beyond, Miller's Pond, what remained of it, glistened darkly. Once a popular swimming spot, the pond was now a shallow, murky pool in the center of a mud flat. Construction equipment stood abandoned for the night, yellow behemoths frozen in their excavation like prehistoric creatures caught in tar. As I picked my way across the muddy ground, my shoes making obscene sucking sounds with each step, I checked my watch again, 11:53. 7 minutes until midnight. I reached the edge of the remaining water and stared at my reflection in the stillness. The moon, full and bright, illuminated my face, a face I was starting to find unfamiliar, as if I were looking at a stranger wearing my features. What was I supposed to do at midnight? Something with my name. My name. Michael. Michael Reed. Michael Reed, I said to my reflection. Michael Reed. The words felt hollow, disconnected from any meaning. Behind me, the mud began to squelch with heavy footsteps that were not my own. I didn't turn around. I knew what was approaching, knew it with the instinctive certainty of prey sensing a predator. Michael Reed, I said more urgently. Michael Reed, Michael Reed. My reflection rippled suddenly, though there was no wind to disturb the water. The face looking back at me shifted, features sliding like wet clay being reshaped by invisible hands. For a moment, it wasn't my face at all, but something ancient and hungry. 11:57. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. The air grew cold, so cold my breath clouded before me. I could feel it standing there, looming, its height casting a long shadow over me and my warped reflection. Michael Reed. I shouted, my voice cracking. Michael Reed, Michael Reed, Michael. The entity placed one inhumanly long hand on my shoulder. Its touch burned with cold through my jacket, through my skin, into my bones. My thoughts scattered like startled birds. My name. What was my name? I fumbled in my pocket for my notes, for the paper where I'd written everything down, but found only a blank sheet. The words had vanished, just as they had in my motel room that first night. 11:59. With shocking speed, the entity spun me around to face it. This close, I could see that what I'd taken for smooth, blank skin where its face should be was actually constantly shifting, thousands of tiny movements, as if countless insects were writhing beneath a membrane. Its chest began to split open, revealing not organs or blood, but a swirling vortex of shadows. From this abyss came a sound, the first sound I'd heard it make, a whisper composed of many voices speaking together. We remember you. The voices were familiar. Sheriff Lowry, the waitress from the diner, the librarian, and others I didn't recognize, the missing people, I realized. All speaking through this thing. We remember so you don't have to. Its grasp tightened, pulling me toward the void in its chest. I struggled, feet slipping in the mud, but its strength was immense. Inch by inch, it drew me closer to the darkness. Midnight. The full moon reflected perfectly in the pond, creating a perfect circle of light. As the entity pulled me toward oblivion, a desperate idea formed. With the last of my strength, I twisted in its grasp and hurled us both sideways, toward the water. We crashed into the shallow pond, sending moonbright water exploding outward. The entity thrashed, its movements suddenly frantic, as if the water caused it pain. I scrambled away, splashing toward the center of the pond. Looking back, I saw the most incredible thing. Where the water touched the entity, its form seemed to dissolve, running like ink in rain. It retreated to the shore, its shape fluctuating wildly between human and something utterly alien. Standing waist deep in the cold pond, I found my voice again. My name is Michael Reed, I said, the words ringing with sudden clarity. I am Michael Reed. The entity convulsed on the shoreline. The void in its chest began to contract, and from it spilled objects, small, personal things. A child's teddy bear, a wedding ring, a set of car keys, a wallet, mementos of the taken, memories made physical. Among them, glinting in the moonlight, I spotted my own voice recorder. Without thinking, I splashed to shore and grabbed it, retreating quickly to the safety of the water. The entity made no move to stop me, seemingly weakened by whatever had just occurred. I pressed play on the recorder. Static hissed, then Sheriff Lowry's voice, clear as day, 7 people gone in 8 months. No connection between them except they all lived here. No signs of struggle. Just gone. The full interview, no longer erased. The entity shuddered. Pieces of it were breaking off now, dissolving into the night air like smoke. I rewound the recorder and played another section, my own voice asking questions, followed by the waitress from the diner describing her missing brother. With each voice that emerged from the recorder, the entity seemed to diminish, collapsing in on itself like a star imploding. I understood then. It fed on memories, on identities. But recorded memories, external, preserved, were poison to it. The entity gave one final, silent spasm and collapsed into a pile of what looked like black sand. For a moment, the pile retained a vaguely humanoid shape, then a breeze scattered it across the mud. Silence fell. The full moon continued its arc across the sky, its reflection now broken by the ripples I had created in the pond. I waded to shore, soaked and shivering but alive. The scattered mementos of the missing lay strewn about, sad little testaments to stolen lives. I gathered as many as I could, knowing they needed to be returned, knowing they were now evidence. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a glint of metal half buried in the mud. I bent and dug it out, a small, tarnished brass plate identical to the one on the handleless door in the alley. And inscribed upon it, in tiny letters I had to squint to read, "See you in 27 years." The realization hit like a physical blow. I hadn't destroyed it. I'd merely disrupted its feeding, forced it back into dormancy. In 27 years, it would return. The cycle would continue. Unless someone stopped it permanently. I pocketed the brass plate and began the long walk back to town, my mind already racing with plans, research to be done, preparations to make. I might not be able to stay in Oakwood Valley for 27 years, but I could certainly document everything, leave warnings, perhaps find others who had encountered the entity and survived. As I passed the cemetery, I made a detour to my own headstone. In the moonlight, I could see that something had changed. The blank space after the dash now contained a date, today's date. But as I watched, the carved numbers began to fade, disappearing until the stone once again read only. Michael Reed, 1990. A promise unfulfilled. A deadline extended. Back at the motel, I found my door unlocked, though I was certain it had locked behind me earlier. Inside, the room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one detail, the mirror I placed on the desk now on perfectly centered on the wall. And written in the steam that somehow covered it, though the room was cold. "I'll be watching." I quickly wiped the message away, but not before taking a photo with my phone as evidence. Then I sat at the desk and began to write, determined to record every detail while the memories remained clear. My name is Michael Reed, and I know what takes people from Oakwood Valley. The morning after my confrontation at Miller's Pond dawned bright and incongruously normal. Birds sang outside my motel window. Cars passed on the main road. Somewhere, a lawnmower droned. I hadn't slept. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the entity's writhing non-face, felt its cold touch on my shoulder. Instead, I'd spent the night organizing my notes, transcribing the recovered recordings, and cataloging the items I gathered from the construction site, 13 personal effects in total, but only 7 people had been reported missing recently. This suggested the entity had been taking people quietly, perhaps transients or individuals whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms before beginning its more noticeable harvest. I lined the objects on the bed, a tarnished locket containing a faded photograph, a hospital identification bracelet, a set of rosary beads, old-fashioned wire-rimmed glasses, a Swiss Army knife with the initials JT scratched into the side, a car key for a Toyota, a child's baseball cap, a silver charm bracelet, a leather wallet, empty of identification but containing $43, a tube of lipstick in a shade called Midnight Rose, a man's wedding ring, a leather-bound pocket, notebook filled with bird-watching observations, and my own voice recorder. Each item represented a life interrupted, a person consumed by the entity. Each deserved justice. I showered, the hot water failing to wash away the memory of the pond's cold embrace or the entity's colder touch. As steam filled the bathroom, I kept my eyes averted from the mirror, unwilling to see if any messages appeared in the condensation. Dressed and somewhat refreshed, I packed my evidence carefully and headed to the sheriff's office. The town seemed different in daylight, ordinary, peaceful, its secrets well hidden beneath picturesque storefronts and friendly greetings from passers-by. Only I knew what lurked beneath the surface, waiting to emerge again in 27 years. Sheriff Lowry wasn't at his desk. Instead, Deputy Evans greeted me, his young face creased with concern. "You're the reporter, right? Have you seen the sheriff? He didn't come in yesterday afternoon or this morning." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Day before yesterday. He said he was going to check on something at the old church on Pine Street, then meet with you." Evans eyed me suspiciously. "Did he find you?" I thought of the false Sheriff Lowry who had knocked on my motel room door. Had that been the entity, or had it already taken the real Lowry by then? "I haven't seen him since our interview at the station," I said carefully. Evans ran a hand through his short hair. "That's not like him. I've tried his house, his cell. Nothing. I might have some information that could help," I said, setting my bag on his desk. "About all the missing persons." For the next 2 hours, I lay out everything I discovered, the 27-year cycle, the connection to environmental disturbances, the entity that fed on memories and identities. I showed him the personal effects I've recovered, played him sections of the restored interview with Sheriff Lowry, and even displayed the brass plate with its ominous inscription. To his credit, Deputy Evans listened without interruption, his expression moving from skepticism to confusion to a grudging sort of belief. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "If anyone else came in here with this story, I'd have them committed," he said finally. "But those items..." He picked up the hospital bracelet, examining the name. "This belongs to Robert Chen. Disappeared 3 months ago. And this," he pointed to the Swiss Army knife, "has to be Jason Turner's. His wife reported him missing just after Christmas." "You believe me, then?" Evans set the bracelet down carefully. "I believe something took these people. I believe Sheriff Lowry might be among them now. As for this entity you described, I don't know. But I know Oakwood Valley has always had more than its share of strange occurrences. I need to document everything before I leave," I said. "Set up safeguards for when it returns in 27 years. Evans frowned. "You're leaving?" "I have to. I need to research similar phenomena in other places, see if anyone's found a permanent solution. And frankly, I don't think it's safe for me to stay. The entity may be dormant, but it marked me somehow. I can feel it. This wasn't entirely true. I wanted to leave because every shadow in this town now seemed to watch me, every reflective surface a potential portal through which the entity might reach. But I also felt a responsibility to the missing to prevent future disappearances. You said this Evelyn White survived an encounter, Evans said thoughtfully. Maybe we should talk to her again. Good idea, I agreed, relieved to have an ally. We drove to Evelyn's cottage in Evans's patrol car, the bag of recovered items secure in the trunk. As we approached her property, I noticed something odd. No smoke rose from her chimney, though the day was cool enough to warrant a fire. Evans noticed too. Something's wrong, he muttered, unsnapping his holster as we approached the front door. It stood slightly ajar. Evans called out, Mrs. White? Deputy Evans, Oakwood Valley Sheriff's Department. No response. He pushed the door open with his foot, hand on his weapon. The cottage was empty. Not just of Evelyn, but of everything, the furniture, the drawings that had covered the walls, all gone. The room stood bare, dust gathering in corners, as if no one had lived there for months. This is impossible, I said, walking from room to room. She was here yesterday. Her drawings were all over these walls. Evans examined the floor, crouching to study faint marks. Looks like furniture was dragged out recently. But why would she leave so suddenly? In what had been Evelyn's bedroom, a single sheet of paper lay in the center of the floor, held down by a small river stone. I approached cautiously and picked it up. A drawing, more detailed than any I'd seen in her house before. It showed the entity, but not as I had encountered it. This version had a face composed of dozens of smaller faces, all contorted in silent screams. Recognizable among them, Sheriff Lowry. And beside him, a woman I assumed was Evelyn herself. At the bottom of the page, a message in her precise handwriting, 27 years is not long enough. It found another way. What does that mean? Evans asked, reading over my shoulder. A terrible suspicion formed. We need to go to the church on Pine Street. Now. The old church stood at the edge of town, its stone walls withered by over a century of seasons. According to the town history I've researched, it had been renovated 27 years ago, just before the last cycle of disappearances. Evans and I approached cautiously, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the churchyard. The heavy wooden doors were unlocked, swinging open at our touch. Inside, dust motes danced in beams of colored light filtering through stained glass windows. The nave appeared empty, rows of pews facing an altar draped in purple cloth. Sheriff? Evans called, his voice echoing. Sheriff Lowry? We moved down the center aisle, footsteps unnaturally loud on the stone floor. At the altar, Evans pointed to something I hadn't noticed, a door to the side, partially concealed behind a tapestry. That leads to the crypt, he whispered. It's been sealed for decades. But it wasn't sealed now. The door stood open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Evans drew his weapon. Stay here, he ordered. Not a chance, I replied, taking out my phone and activating its flashlight. Together we descended, the air growing colder with each step. The beam of light revealed a low-ceiling chamber filled with stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with the likenesses of the dead interred within. And at the far end of the crypt, a familiar sight, a door with no handle, just a tarnished brass plate where one should be. That's it, I breathed. The door from the alley. As we approached, I noticed something else. The floor around the door was wet, a thin layer of water reflecting our lights. And floating in the water, a handful of small objects, personal effects identical to those I collected at Miller's Pond. It's been here all along, I said, understanding dawning. The door in the alley was just a projection, a lure. This is its true entrance. Evans knelt to examine the water. Is that pond water? Did you bring it here somehow? Before I could answer, a voice spoke from the top of the stairs, Sheriff Lowry's voice. I knew you'd figure it out eventually, Reed. We turned to see Lowry descending the steps, his movements oddly fluid, his face obscured in shadow. Sheriff? Evans lowered his weapon slightly. Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere for you. I've been right here, Lowry said, stepping into the light. Preparing. His face was wrong, not obviously so at first glance, but fundamentally incorrect upon closer inspection. His features seemed to shift subtly, as if I were viewing him through rippling water. That's not Lowry, I warned Evans, backing toward the handleless door. Too late. Lowry, or the thing wearing his shape, moved with blinding speed, closing the distance between us in an instant. One elongated hand gripped Evans by the throat, lifting him off his feet. 27 years is such a long time to wait, the false Lowry said, its voice now a chorus of many voices speaking in unison. But Evelyn showed me another way. A host. A vessel to carry me through the dorming years. Evans struggled, his face purpling, gun firing wildly. The bullets passed through the false Lowry as if through smoke. I lunged for the brass plate on the door, pressing it desperately. Nothing happened. The entity, still wearing Lowry's dissolving face, turned to me. You brought the water that weakened me. Clever. But temporary. It tossed Evans aside like a rag doll. He hit one of the sarcophagi with a sickening crack and lay still. I was alone with the entity as it shed Lowry's form entirely, growing taller, thinner, its faceless head nearly brushing the low ceiling. You make an excellent vessel, Michael Reed, it said. Your curiosity, your memories, your desire to understand, all perfect for my needs. It reached for me with both impossibly long arms. I had nowhere to run, my back literally against the door. In desperation, I grabbed my phone and began playing the recording of Sheriff Lowry's interview, the real Lowry's voice filling the crypt. The entity hesitated, its form flickering like a candle in wind. I remembered what had happened at the pond, how the recordings had weakened it, how preserved memories seemed to act as a repellent. An idea struck. I aimed my phone's camera at the entity and began recording. What are you doing? It asked, its many-voiced speech now uncertain. Remembering you, I answered, continuing to film. Ensuring you're never forgotten. The entity shrank back, its form destabilizing further. Even in your dormant state, you'll be documented, studied, understood, I continued, advancing slowly. No more shadows. No more mystery. No more power through obscurity. It made a sound then, a terrible, splintering wail that threatened to burst my eardrums. The water on the floor began to vibrate, forming rippling patterns that mirrored the entity's dissolving shape. The brass plate on the door behind me suddenly grew warm against my back. I spun and pressed it, and this time the door swung open, not into darkness, but into blinding light. Without hesitation, I dragged the unconscious Evans toward the doorway. The entity lunged for us, its form now barely humanoid, more like a storm of black particles swirling in air. We tumbled through the doorway together, the light enveloping us. The entity's wail cut off abruptly as the door slammed shut behind us. When my vision cleared, we were lying on the shore of Miller's Pond, not the drain construction site, but the pond as it must have been years ago, full and pristine, surrounded by undisturbed forest. Evans groaned, beginning to regain consciousness. A quick check confirmed he was injured, but not critically, cracked ribs, possibly a concussion. "Where are we?" he mumbled, trying to sit up. "When is probably the better question," I replied, taking in our surroundings. A newspaper lay nearby, half buried in sand. I dug it out and checked the date, October 12, 2000. 27 years before my arrival in Oakwood Valley. The beginning of the previous cycle. We had passed through the door into the past, which meant we had 27 years to prepare for the entity's next emergence. 27 years to find a permanent solution to break the cycle once and for all. As Evans regained his bearings, I helped him to his feet. "We have a lot of work to do," I told him, "and a long time to do it in." "What about getting back to our time?" he asked, wincing with pain. I looked out over the tranquil pond, considering. "I'm not sure we can. Or should. Think about it. We know when and where the entity will appear. We can be ready." Evans nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "We can save them. All of them. And ourselves," I added. As we made our way toward town, a town that would not recognize us, where we would have to build new identities, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by the entity, dormant now for another 27 years, but by someone or something else. Perhaps by all the selves I had been and would be. Perhaps by the universe itself, bearing witness to this broken loop in time. Or perhaps it was merely the weight of responsibility, the burden of knowledge. My name is Michael Reed, and I know it takes people from Oakwood Valley. Now I have 27 years to stop it. But as we walked, I glanced back at the pond one last time and saw, just for an instant, a reflection that was not my own. A face composed of many faces, watching me from beneath the still waters. Waiting. What happens when the things we dismiss as childish fears turn out to be warnings? The attic of my grandmother's Victorian house had always been off limits during my childhood visits. "Too dangerous," she would say with that stern look that brooked no argument. Now, as I sorted through her belongings after her passing, I finally understood why. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I moved carefully through the dusty space, my flashlight cutting through decades of accumulated shadows. My name is Eleanor Winters, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a rational person. I was a high school English teacher who believed in logic and reason. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But now I'm not so sure about anything anymore. I had taken a leave of absence to handle grandmother's estate, a process I expected to be straightforward if emotionally taxing. The house itself was a masterpiece of late 19th century architecture, all dark wood and intricate details, situated at the end of a quiet lane in a small New England town. It would fetch a good price once I finished clearing it out, though part of me ached at the thought of strangers inhabiting these rooms filled with memories. The attic was my final frontier. I'd been putting it off, dreading the climb up the narrow stairs and the inevitable dust that would cling to my clothes and hair. But it had to be done. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old paper and something else, something faintly metallic that made my nose wrinkle. My flashlight beam danced across forgotten furniture draped in yellowed sheets, stacks of magazines from decades past, and several trunks that likely contained more of my grandmother's keepsakes. It was the smallest trunk, tucked away in the farthest corner, that caught my attention. Unlike the others with their peeling leather and tarnished clasps, this one appeared well maintained, its brass fittings gleaming as if recently polished. Strange, considering the layer of dust covering everything else. I approached slowly, a sudden chill raising goosebumps along my arms despite the stifling heat of the attic. The trunk wasn't locked. As I lifted the lid, hinges moving soundlessly, I half expected moths to flutter out or perhaps a cloud of dust. Instead, I found myself staring at a single item nestled in faded purple velvet. A doll. Not a plastic modern toy, but an antique porcelain doll with an intricately painted face. Its glass eyes were a striking shade of blue that seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam rather than reflect it. Dark curls framed a delicate face with rosy cheeks and a small, serious mouth. The doll wore a cream-colored dress with lace trimmings that had yellowed with age but remained intact. "Hello there," I whispered, not knowing why I felt compelled to speak. "Where did you come from?" As I reached to lift the doll from its velvet bed, a gust of wind rattled the attic window. I jumped, heart suddenly racing. The house was old, drafts were common. Nothing unusual. I laughed nervously at my own reaction and carefully picked up the doll. It was heavier than it looked and cold to the touch despite the warm air. Turning it over, I found a small key protruding from its back. A music box doll, then. Curious, I gave the key a gentle twist. Nothing happened. The mechanism was likely broken after all these years. I set the doll aside and searched the trunk for any information about its origin. At the bottom, I found a faded photograph of a young girl holding the very same doll. The girl's face was partially obscured by a blur, as if she had moved at the moment the picture was taken. On the back, written in faded ink, Elizabeth with Lily, 1923. Elizabeth. The name stirred something in my memory. Hadn't my grandmother mentioned a younger sister who died as a child? I couldn't recall the details. It was one of those family stories mentioned in passing but never fully explained. As I contemplated this, the attic suddenly felt colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the silence took on a watchful quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the doll, and for a split second, so brief I convinced myself I'd imagined it, I thought its head had turned slightly toward me. "Time to go downstairs," I muttered, gathering the doll and photograph. "Getting too stuffy up here." I placed the doll on my grandmother's writing desk in the study while I continued sorting through papers. Throughout the afternoon, I found myself glancing up at it, unsettled by how its glass eyes seemed to follow my movements. Once, when I returned from the kitchen with a cup of tea, I could have sworn it was sitting at a slightly different angle. "You're being ridiculous, Eleanor," I told myself firmly. "It's just an old doll." But that night, as I prepared for bed in the guest room, I deliberately placed the doll on a shelf facing away from me. I couldn't explain the impulse. It just felt wrong to have those glass eyes watching me sleep. I drifted off quickly, exhausted from the day's work. It might have been hours or minutes later when I woke with a start, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, but I had the distinct impression that something had changed. A sound had woken me, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of tiny porcelain feet on hardwood floors. I lay frozen, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the normal creaks and sighs of an old house settling. Then I heard it, a delicate tinkling melody, so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been holding my breath. The distinct notes of a music box, coming from inside my room. My hand trembled as I reached for the lamp on the bedside table. As light flooded the room, my scream caught in my throat. The doll sat on the dresser directly opposite my bed, facing me. and the key in its back was slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning on its own. Morning came with a merciful brightness that made the previous night's terror seem absurd. The doll sat exactly where I had originally placed it on the shelf, facing away from the bed. No music box melody echoed in my ears, just the cheerful chirping of birds outside my window. Stress and an overactive imagination, I told my reflection as I brushed my teeth. The circles under my eyes told a different story. I'd spent the remainder of the night with the lights on, unable to close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. I decided to learn more about the doll. Perhaps understanding its history would dispel my irrational fear. I carefully placed it in a tote bag. Somehow, I couldn't bear to look at it directly this morning and drove into town to visit the local historical society. The historical society occupied a modest brick building on Main Street. Inside, the air smelled of old books and furniture polish. An elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his desk as I entered. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Walter Jenkins. How can I help you today?" "I'm Eleanor Winters, Margaret Winters' granddaughter," I explained, setting my bag on a nearby chair. "I'm clearing out our house and found something interesting I hoped you might know about." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Margaret, yes. I was sorry to hear of her passing. Fine woman, always supported our little society." He leaned forward. "What have you found?" I carefully removed the doll from my bag and placed it on his desk. Walter's reaction was immediate and disturbing. He recoiled, his face draining of color. "Where did you find this?" His voice had lost all warmth. "In the attic. In a trunk." I showed him the photograph as well. "I think this might be my grandmother's sister Elizabeth, the one who died young." Walter's hands trembled slightly as he took the photograph. "Yes, Elizabeth Winters. Tragic case." He glanced at the doll, then quickly back to me. "This doll belonged to her. What happened to her?" I asked. Walter sighed, removing his glasses to polish them, a delaying tactic, I thought. "Elizabeth died in 1923. She was only 8 years old. Found in her bedroom. Heart failure, they said, but what? There were rumors. The town was different back then. People were more superstitious." He replaced his glasses. "Elizabeth had been complaining about her doll. Said it moved on its own. Whispered to her at night." A chill ran through me. And no one believed her. Her parents thought she was having nightmares. Then one morning, they found her. Walter trailed off. The strange thing was, the doll was sitting on her chest. The doctor said her heart just stopped, but her face, he stopped himself. "I'm sorry. This is all just town gossip from 100 years ago." "What happened to the doll afterward?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Your grandmother took it. She and Elizabeth were close, despite the age difference. Margaret would have been around 16 when it happened. She kept that doll, though I never understood why." Walter studied my face. "Miss Winters, if I may offer some advice, some things are better left in the past." I left the historical society with more questions than answers, the doll once again secured in my bag. As I drove back to the house, I couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth. A little girl whose fears were dismissed as childish imagination, only to be found dead with the very object of her terror perched on her chest. That evening, I searched through my grandmother's papers more thoroughly. In a locked drawer of her desk, I found a leather-bound journal. The first entry was dated September 12, 1923, just days after Elizabeth's death. I know what they say, that Lizzie's heart was weak, that it was her time. But I was the one who gave her that cursed doll for her birthday. I found it in the antique shop and thought it beautiful. How was I to know? The whispers started the very first night. Lizzie told me, but I laughed it off. What kind of big sister am I? Now she's gone, and I am left with this terrible knowledge and this terrible doll. I cannot destroy it. I've tried. The fire wouldn't catch, the hammer wouldn't break it. It always returns, unblemished. So I will keep it safe where it cannot harm another child. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. Outside, the sun had set, leaving the house in shadow. I glanced at the doll, which I placed on a distant bookshelf. Its painted face revealed nothing, but in the fading light, its glass eyes seemed to gleam with inner awareness. "You can't harm me," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the empty room. "I'm not a child." As if in response, the lights flickered briefly. Just an old house with old wiring, I told myself. Nothing supernatural about it. I decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would wash away my growing unease. As steam filled the bathroom, I could have sworn I heard the faint melody of a music box coming from down the hall. I rushed through my shower and, wrapped in a towel, cautiously made my way back to the study. The doll hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. But as I approached, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A small puddle of water on the floor beneath the bookshelf. I looked up. The ceiling was dry. The water hadn't come from above. Tiny wet footprints led from the puddle to the doll. I backed away, nearly tripping over a chair. The footprints were too small to be human, exactly the size of the doll's porcelain feet. And they were coming from the direction of the bathroom. "This isn't happening," I whispered, clutching my towel tighter around me. I spent that night in my car, parked at a well-lit gas station at the edge of town. I told myself I was being absurd, that there had to be a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. Water from a leaky pipe that I hadn't noticed. The wind making sounds that resembled a music box. The doll moving because the house settled, tilting surfaces imperceptibly. But deep down, I knew. The journal entries, Walter's reaction, the cold weight of the doll in my hands, it all pointed to something beyond rational explanation. When dawn broke, I returned to the house, determined to pack the doll away and consider what to do next. But as I entered the study, I stopped dead in my tracks. The doll was gone from the shelf. I searched the room with growing panic, finally spotting it seated at my grandmother's writing desk. A sheet of paper lay before it, and clutched in its tiny porcelain hand was a pencil. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. On the paper, written in the shaky handwriting of a child, were 4 words. She didn't believe me. As I stood there, frozen in horror, I heard it, the distinct sound of a child giggling from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the empty room and the growing certainty that I was not alone in this house. Not alone at all. I called a local hotel and booked a room. I wasn't about to spend another night in that house, not with the doll and whatever presence it harbored. As I threw essential items into an overnight bag, I tried to rationalize my next steps. Should I just leave town, abandon the house and its contents? The practical part of me balked at the idea. The property was worth substantial money, and I have responsibilities as the executor of my grandmother's estate. No, I needed to understand what was happening. And perhaps more importantly, I needed to find a way to contain or neutralize the doll. Before leaving, I hesitated, then went back to the study. The doll still sat at the desk, pencil in hand. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I carefully placed it back in its original trunk, closed the lid, and carried the trunk down to the basement. I set it on a high shelf and piled several heavy boxes in front of it. "Stay there," I whispered, feeling ridiculous for addressing an inanimate object, yet unable to shake the certainty that it could hear me. At the hotel, I slept deeply for the first time in days, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. I woke to bright sunshine streaming through thin curtains and the distant sounds of the town coming to life. For a blissful moment, I forgot everything until reality crashed back. I spent the morning researching online, searching for information about haunted dolls and how to deal with them. Most of what I found seemed like superstitious nonsense, but certain patterns emerged. Objects could become vessels for spirits. Tragic deaths, especially of children, sometimes created lingering presences. The more I read, the more I became convinced that Elizabeth's spirit somehow resided within the doll. But was it Elizabeth who had written those chilling words? She didn't believe me. Who hadn't believed her? My grandmother? Or someone else entirely? The hotel room suddenly felt stifling. I needed to talk to someone who might have more information. Walter at the Historical Society had seemed to know more than he was willing to share. I decided to pay him another visit. The society was quiet when I arrived, with just a young woman organizing pamphlets at the front desk. "I'm looking for Walter Jenkins," I said. "Mr. Jenkins isn't in today," she replied with a smile. "Is there something I can help you with? Do you know when he'll be back? It's quite important." Her smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Jenkins won't be coming in for a while. He had some kind of episode yesterday afternoon, right after you left, actually. His daughter said he was going on about some doll and a little girl named Elizabeth." My blood ran cold. "Is he all right?" "They've taken him to the hospital in the next town over. Doctors think it might have been a stroke." She looked at me curiously. "What exactly did you two discuss?" I mumbled something about local history and left quickly, guilt gnawing at me. Had showing Walter the doll somehow triggered this episode? Or was it merely coincidence? With nowhere else to turn, I drove back to my grandmother's house. I needed to find that journal again to see if there were more entries that might explain what was happening. The house seemed darker than it should have been in the middle of the day, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floors and walls. I hurried to the study and retrieved the journal from the desk drawer. Then, steeling myself, I went to check on the doll. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. My breath formed small clouds as I descended the stairs. The boxes I had piled in front of the trunk were undisturbed, exactly as I had left them. Relief washed over me. Perhaps the doll's influence couldn't extend beyond a certain distance. I turned to go back upstairs when a soft sound stopped me, the delicate notes of a music box coming from behind the wall. I pressed my ear against the cold concrete. The melody was clearer now, accompanied by something else, a child's voice, singing softly. Round and round the garden, like a teddy bear. I stumbled backward. This section of the basement shouldn't have anything behind it. It was the exterior wall, with solid earth beyond. 1 step, 2 step. The singing stopped abruptly. Then, so faintly I almost missed it. "I know you're there, Miss Eleanor." I fled upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. That voice, it had known my name. Back in the study, I began reading through more of my grandmother's journal entries, desperate for answers. The entries spanned decades, detailing her efforts to contain what she called the malevolence within the doll. November 4th, 1942, it has been nearly 20 years, and still, I cannot be free of it. Last night, I heard Lizzie calling to me from the basement. But it wasn't Lizzie, I know that now. Whatever speaks with her voice is something else, something that was merely waiting for a vessel and a tragedy to exploit. I've consulted with Father Thomas, sworn him to secrecy. He blessed the house, but it made no difference. The entity is contained within the doll itself. June 21st, 1968, Michael almost found the trunk today. He was playing hide and seek with the neighborhood children and strayed into the attic. I've never moved so quickly in my life. He doesn't understand why I was so angry, why I've forbidden him from the attic. How can I explain? My own son would think me mad. But I've seen what happens to children who come too close to that thing. Never again. Not while I draw breath. Michael, my father. He had never mentioned any such incident to me, but then he had left town as soon as he was old enough and rarely spoke of his childhood. The most recent entry was dated just 3 months before my grandmother's death. January 15th, 2025, I am old now, and my time approaches. I worry about what will happen when I am gone. The binding spell has held all these years, keeping it contained to this house, unable to harm anyone beyond these walls. But spells require renewal, and there will be no one to maintain it. I should have destroyed it long ago, found a way despite its resistance. Now it may be too late. Forgive me, Eleanor. The burden passes to you. A binding spell? My practical, no-nonsense grandmother had been practicing some form of magic? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was before me in her own handwriting. As I pondered this revelation, a thunderous crash came from upstairs. I froze, listening. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. I should leave, I thought. Call someone, the police, a priest, anyone. Instead, I found myself climbing the stairs, drawn upward by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The sound had come from my bedroom. The door stood ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw the destruction. The mirror above the dresser had shattered, glass shards scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room, sitting primly on the edge of the bed, was the doll. Its painted face was as expressionless as ever, but now I could sense something behind those glass eyes, something ancient and malevolent that had never been Elizabeth, merely wearing her tragedy like a costume. What do you want? I whispered. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded the air as frost began to form patterns on the remaining fragments of mirror. A child's voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere, to play, Miss Eleanor. Elizabeth never wanted to play with me. Neither did Margaret. Will you play with me? The door slammed shut behind me. And in the abrupt darkness, I saw the doll's eyes begin to glow with an inner light. This isn't real, I said, my voice quavering in the frigid air. You're not real. Laughter echoed around me, high and childlike, but with an undercurrent of something ancient and wrong. The doll hadn't moved, yet somehow I knew the sound came from it. Not real? The voice was petulant now. Elizabeth thought I was real. Margaret knew I was real. They tried to leave me alone, locked away. It's not nice to be alone, Miss Eleanor. I edged toward the door, my hand fumbling behind me for the knob. It was ice cold and wouldn't turn. "What are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The doll's head tilted slightly, an impossible movement for porcelain. "I am Lily," the name from the photograph. "I am old. Older than this house. Older than this town. I was lonely until Elizabeth found me." "You killed her," I said, anger momentarily overriding my fear. The temperature dropped further. Frost crept across the floorboards toward my feet. She was fragile. Her heart couldn't take our games. The doll's voice held no remorse. Margaret was stronger. She found ways to keep me contained. But she's gone now. My grandmother's journal entries flashed through my mind. The binding spell she had mentioned, whatever it was, it had apparently weakened with her death. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "A new friend." The doll's head turned fully toward me now, the movement smooth and natural. "Someone to stay with. Forever." The frost reached my feet, a biting cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. I had to get out, had to find whatever my grandmother had used to bind this thing. "I'll be your friend," I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. "But I need time to prepare." The laughter came again, sharper now. "Liar. You're just like Margaret. Always lying, always trying to trick me." The frost climbed up my legs, numbing everything it touched. No more waiting. No more tricks. With a strength born of desperation, I threw myself against the door. It gave way suddenly, sending me sprawling into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet and ran down the stairs, heading for the study where I'd left my grandmother's journal. Behind me, I heard the patter of tiny feet on the hardwood floor. "You can't leave, Miss Eleanor. The house won't let you." I grabbed the journal and continued to the front door, yanking it open, only to find myself staring at a solid brick wall where the porch should have been. I turned and tried the back door with the same result. Every window showed only darkness beyond, as if the house now existed in a void. "Told you," came the sing-song voice from the top of the stairs. The doll sat there, its painted smile seeming wider than before. "Now we can play forever." I retreated to the study, locking the door behind me, though I doubted it would provide any real barrier. Frantic, I flipped through the journal, searching for anything that might help. Near the back, I found several pages written in what looked like Latin, with diagrams and symbols I didn't recognize. The binding spell, it had to be. But I had no idea how to use it, no understanding of whatever magic my grandmother had employed. A soft scratching came from the other side of the study door. "Miss Eleanor? Don't you want to play hide and seek? I'm very good at finding people." The scratching intensified, becoming a violent scraping as if tiny porcelain fingernails were trying to dig through the wood. I continued searching the journal, desperation mounting. Then I noticed something, a small key taped to the inside back cover. It looked familiar, the music box key. The one in the doll's back. My grandmother's final entry replayed in my mind. The binding spell has held all these years. What if the key was part of the binding? Not just a music box mechanism, but something more? The door handle began to turn slowly. The lock wouldn't hold for long. I had to get to the doll, had to remove the key before it could enter the room. But how? I was trapped, and the entity controlling the doll was clearly growing stronger by the minute. The window. I glanced at it, seeing only darkness beyond. But what if that was part of the illusion? What if there was a way to break through? I grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the window. Instead of shattering glass, there was a sound like tearing fabric. The darkness rippled, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of the yard beyond before the void closed again. So it was an illusion, but a powerful one. I needed something stronger, something connected to the entity itself to break through. The journal. My grandmother's words, her knowledge of this thing. I tore out the pages containing the binding spell and approached the window, holding them up like a shield. By Margaret's will, by her blood which is my blood, I command you to reveal the truth, I improvised, hoping that intent would matter more than specific words. The darkness wavered, thinning in places. I pressed the pages against the window and felt them grow warm in my hands. Behind me, the door burst open. The doll stood in the doorway, but it was changing. Its porcelain surface seemed to flow like wax, features shifting into something less human, more primal. The glass eyes had grown, consuming most of its face. And no, it shrieked, the childlike voice giving way to something deeper, guttural. The journal pages burst into flame in my hands, but instead of burning me, the fire spread to the window, consuming the darkness. Beyond, I could see the yard, the street, reality. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself at the window, crashing through into the night air beyond. I landed hard on the lawn, the breath knocked from my lungs. Rolling over, I looked back at the house. It appeared normal from the outside, lights blazing from every window. And there, watching me from the study window, was the doll. Its face was pressed against the glass, features contorted in rage. But it didn't, or couldn't, follow. I struggled to my feet and staggered to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back one last time. The doll was gone from the window. Instead, it now stood on the front porch, at the very edge of the threshold but not crossing it. My grandmother's binding might be weakening, but it still held in some fashion. The entity couldn't leave the house. At least, not yet. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that house. But even as dawn broke, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I had escaped, but I hadn't defeated it. And sooner or later, I would have to go back. Because if I didn't find a way to strengthen the binding, or better yet, destroy the doll completely, it would eventually break free. And then, no one would be safe. As I crossed the state line, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "I'll be waiting, Miss Eleanor. Don't be long. I get so lonely without a friend to play with." I nearly drove off the road. When I checked the message again moments later, it was gone, as if it had never existed. But I knew better now. I knew what waited in my grandmother's house. And I knew I couldn't run forever. 3 days. I gave myself 3 days to prepare for my return to the house. 3 days in a motel room 2 towns over, researching everything I could find about entities that possess objects, binding spells, and ways to destroy supernatural threats. I spoke with a professor of folklore at the State University, describing a theoretical situation involving a haunted doll. I consulted with a Catholic priest who specialized in unusual spiritual phenomena, though I was careful not to mention specifics that might make me sound delusional. I even tracked down a self-described practitioner of protective magic, an elderly woman who ran an occult bookshop in a nearby city. From these conversations and my research, I pieced together a plan. It wasn't foolproof, nothing involving the supernatural could be, but it gave me purpose, a way forward other than simply running. The entity in the doll, Lily, was old, predating even the doll itself. The doll was merely its current vessel, chosen perhaps for its ability to appear innocent while harboring something malevolent. My grandmother had managed to bind it to the house, preventing it from causing harm beyond those walls. But with her death, that binding was weakening. The key in the doll's back seemed to be central to the binding. Not just a music box mechanism, but a symbolic lock, keeping the entity trapped within the porcelain form. If I could strengthen that binding, perhaps I could contain it permanently. And if containment failed, I would need to destroy it completely, something my grandmother had apparently tried and failed to do. On the fourth day, I drove back to the small New England town, my car trunk filled with the tools of my desperate plan: salt, iron filings, blessed water from the priest, herbs recommended by the occult shop owner, and photocopies of the binding spell from my grandmother's journal. I had memorized as much of the Latin as I could, though pronunciation remained a challenge. I arrived at the house just after noon, parking across the street rather than in the driveway. The building looked normal in the daylight, just a grand old Victorian with peeling paint and overgrown shrubbery. No one would guess what dwelled within. As I approached the front door, key in hand, I felt resistance, not physical, but a pressure against my mind, urging me to turn back, to forget, to run. I pushed through it, focusing on what I needed to do. The house was silent as I entered, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the windows. Everything appeared undisturbed, exactly as I had left it during my hasty escape. There was no sign of the doll. I began my preparations, starting in the study where the boundary between reality and the entity's illusions had proven weakest. I laid down a circle of salt mixed with iron filings, large enough for me to sit within. At the cardinal points, I placed candles infused with the protective herbs. The binding spell was arranged before me, along with the blessed water and a silver letter opener I'd found among my grandmother's things, silver being traditionally effective against supernatural entities. Now I just needed the doll. "Lily," I called out, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I've come back to play." Silence answered me, but I could feel the atmosphere in the house changing, growing heavier, expectant. I continued my preparations, lighting the candles and reciting the opening lines of the binding spell. Latin words felt strange on my tongue, but I pressed on, sensing their power as they resonated in the air. A child's laugh echoed from upstairs, followed by the patter of small feet running down the hallway. "Hide and seek," came the lilting voice. "I'll count to 10. 1, 2. I remained in my circle, gripping the silver letter opener tightly. "No games, Lily. Come face me if you can." The counting stopped. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, frost forming along the edges of the windows despite the summer heat outside. "You're no fun, Miss Eleanor." The voice came from just outside the study door now. Margaret was no fun either. Always rules, always binding, always hiding me away. The door swung open slowly, revealing the doll standing in the hallway. It looked different now, the porcelain cracked in places, dark veins spreading across its once perfect surface. The glass eyes were clouded, as if something moved behind them. But Margaret is gone now, and her spells grow weak. The doll took a step forward, then stopped at the threshold of the study, eyeing the salt circle warily. "What do you think you're doing with all this?" "Finishing what my grandmother started," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The doll's head tilted, an unnatural angle that no human child could achieve. "You can't bind me. You don't have her power. You don't have her knowledge." "I have her blood," I countered. "And I have her determination." I began reciting the binding spell, my voice gaining strength with each word. The Latin phrases felt more natural now, as if my grandmother's knowledge flowed through me. The doll's porcelain face contorted in anger, cracks spreading further across its surface. "Stop!" it shrieked, the childlike voice giving way to something ancient and inhuman. "By blood and breath, by fire and earth, I bind thee," I continued, ignoring its command. The doll lunged forward, but recoiled at the edge of the salt circle, hissing like a wounded animal. The air around us began to vibrate, pressure building as if a storm were brewing inside the room. "You cannot contain me," it snarled. "I was ancient when your kind still cowered in caves. I have worn many vessels, taken many forms. This house, this doll, these are temporary prisons. I will outlast you, as I outlasted Margaret." Objects began to fly around the room, books, paperweights, picture frames, crashing against walls and shattering. I ducked but maintained my position within the circle, continuing the incantation. Wind whipped through the study, but all windows remained closed, pages of books fluttering like frightened birds. "I know what you are now," I said during a pause in the spell. "Not a ghost, not a demon. Something in between. Something that feeds on fear and innocence." The doll's laughter was a terrible sound, like glass breaking. Clever girl. Almost as clever as Elizabeth. She understood too, at the end. Just before her heart gave out. Rage flared within me at the casual mention of the child's death. "You won't claim another victim. Not ever again." I reached the final phrases of the binding spell, the words burning in my throat as if physically manifesting. The candles flared, flames shooting upward. The salt circle began to glow with a soft blue light. The doll shrieked, a sound so piercing I felt as if my eardrums might burst. It threw itself against the invisible barrier of the circle repeatedly, each impact creating spiderweb cracks across its porcelain body. "You need the key," it taunted between assaults. "The key in my back. You'll never reach it while I live." It was right. The binding required the key, turned in a specific sequence according to my grandmother's notes. Without it, the spell would be incomplete, temporary at best. I had one chance, one moment to act. I raised the silver letter opener, waiting for the doll to throw itself against the barrier again. When it did, I thrust my arm through the salt line, breaking the circle's protection. The doll immediately latched onto my wrist, porcelain fingers burning cold where they touched my skin. But I had anticipated this. With my other hand, I plunged the silver letter opener into its back, directly beside the key. The doll froze, its glass eyes widening in shock or pain, I couldn't tell which. Frost spread up my arm where it gripped me, numbing the flesh, but I ignored it, using the letter opener to lever the key upward. "No!" it screamed, the sound no longer even remotely human. "No!" With a final twist, I extracted the key. The doll collapsed, suddenly lifeless, a mere object once more. But I could feel the malevolence still present, swirling around us, seeking another vessel. I quickly repaired the salt circle with my free hand, then placed the key in the center of the binding diagram I had prepared. Following my grandmother's notes, I turned it 3 times clockwise, then once counterclockwise, reciting the final words of the spell. Per sanguinem meum, per voluntatem meam, vincitio tii nunc et in aeternum. The key began to glow, first red, then white hot. The temperature in the room plummeted further, frost forming on every surface. A howling filled the air, not wind but voices, hundreds of voices crying out in rage and pain. Then, abruptly, silence. The key cooled, now transformed. No longer a simple music box mechanism, it had twisted into a complex knot of metal, symbols etched along its surface that hadn't been there before. The binding was complete, stronger than before. But I wasn't finished. My grandmother had tried to destroy the doll and failed. I intended to succeed where she had faltered. Still within the protective circle, I gathered the doll's remains and placed them in a metal container I had prepared, lined with salt and iron. I poured the blessed water over the broken porcelain, watching as it hissed and steamed on contact. By my will, by my blood, I consign you to oblivion, I said, not part of any formal spell, but a declaration of my intent. I carried the container to the backyard, where I had dug a deep hole that morning. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. It seemed fitting. Layer by layer, I filled the hole, first salt, then the container with the doll, then iron filings, more salt, and finally dirt. Over this, I placed a heavy stone I had selected from the garden, one side of which I had carved with protective symbols under the guidance of the occult shop owner. "It's done," I whispered, exhausted to my very bones. That night, I slept in the house one last time. No dreams disturbed me, no ghostly footsteps echoed in the hallways. In the morning, I began the process of emptying the house in earnest, determined to sell it and leave this town behind. 2 weeks later, as I packed the final boxes into a moving van, Walter Jenkins from the Historical Society paid me a visit. He looked much recovered from his episode. "I heard you were leaving," he said, leaning heavily on his cane. "There's nothing for me here," I replied, not quite meeting his eyes. Walter nodded, understanding more than I had said. "The doll?" "Dealt with," I said simply. He studied me for a long moment. "Your grandmother would be proud. Not everyone could have done what you did." "How much do you know?" I asked. "Enough to keep my distance all these years. Enough to recognize when a burden has been passed and when it has been lifted." He patted my arm gently. "The town owes you a debt, though they'll never know it." I drove away from that house, from that town, with no intention of returning. The key, now a twisted knot of metal, hung from a chain around my neck, a reminder and a responsibility. Whatever entity had possessed the doll was bound more tightly than ever, buried deep where it couldn't harm anyone. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, I still wake to the phantom sound of a music box playing and the soft patter of porcelain feet on hardwood floors. And I wonder if some bindings, no matter how strong, are truly permanent. After all, even the deepest buried secrets have a way of resurfacing eventually. The Metropolitan Museum of Historical Photography wasn't my usual haunt. As a photography restoration specialist, I preferred my quiet workshop with its controlled lighting and specialized equipment. But when Dr. Eleanor Richards, the museum's curator and an old colleague from graduate school, called me with urgency in her voice, I couldn't refuse her request for a consultation. "Philip, something's happening to the Wellesley collection," she'd said, her typically composed voice wavering. "I need someone I can trust to look at them. Someone who understands the chemical properties of 19th century photographic processes." The museum occupied a renovated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Boston, its dark wood paneling and crimson wallpaper creating an appropriately somber atmosphere for the historical treasures within. As I passed through the main gallery, I noticed how the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished floor. Something about those shadows seemed wrong, too angular, too defined, as if they belonged to objects not present in the room. Eleanor met me at the entrance to the special collections room, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked, following her through the security door. "The Wellesley Collection. 53 daguerreotypes and ambrotypes taken between 1848 and 1865, primarily of Civil War soldiers and their families." She unlocked a climate-controlled display case. "They were donated 3 months ago by the Wellesley estate. We've been preparing them for the upcoming exhibition." "And what's the problem?" Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she carefully removed one of the cases. "This is Lieutenant James Harper, 12th Massachusetts Infantry. Killed at Antietam in September 1862. She handed me the small, ornate case. Inside was a daguerreotype of a young soldier, perhaps 25, with a stiff military posture and the serious expression common in photographs of that era. "Looks well preserved," I commented, examining the surface for oxidation or other damage. "Look at his eyes," Eleanor urged. I used my pocket loupe to examine the image more closely. The lieutenant's eyes seemed to contain an unusual depth, almost as if they were moist with unshed tears. "There might be some silver mirroring occurring," I suggested. "It's common with—" "It's not deterioration," Eleanor interrupted. 2 days ago, his expression was different. He was staring straight ahead with a standard military gaze. Now he's looking to the side, and his eyes, they look frightened." I lowered the loupe and studied her face. "Eleanor, daguerreotypes don't change. The image is physically etched onto the silver plate." "I know how daguerreotypes work, Philip." Her voice had an edge of frustration. "I've been curating this collection for 20 years. But I'm telling you, these photographs are changing." She took the case back and replaced it in the display, then removed another. "Catherine Dunleavy, 1855. The wife of a Boston merchant." The photograph showed a middle-aged woman in an elaborate dress with lace collar, her hair parted in the middle and drawn back smoothly. "What am I looking for?" I asked. "Her mouth," Eleanor said. "When we cataloged this piece, she had a neutral expression. Now she's almost smiling." I examined the photograph carefully. There did appear to be the ghost of a smile playing at the woman's lips, giving her a secretive, knowing look that seemed at odds with the formality of her pose. "It could be a trick of light, or a perception," I said, though something about the woman's expression made my skin prickle. Facial expressions in early photography are notoriously hard to interpret because of the long exposure times. Eleanor sighed heavily. "I've documented all the changes. I've been taking digital photographs of each piece every morning. Come to my office." As we walked through the dim corridor connecting the exhibition space to the administrative offices, I felt a peculiar sensation, as if something cold brushed against the back of my neck. When I turned, there was nothing but the empty hallway, though the portraits lining the walls seemed to watch our passage with unusual intensity. Eleanor's office was cluttered with books, archival materials, and several computer monitors. She pulled up a folder on her main screen labeled Wellesley Changes. "Here," she said, opening side-by-side images of Lieutenant Harper. The left was taken when we received the collection. The right was yesterday. I leaned in, my professional skepticism wavering. The difference was subtle but undeniable. In the earlier photograph, the lieutenant stared straight ahead with military stoicism. In the more recent one, his eyes had shifted slightly to his right, and there was a tenseness to his jaw that hadn't been there before. This could be different lighting conditions, different angles when you took the reference photos, I suggested, but my voice lacked conviction. Look at these, Eleanor said, pulling out more comparison images. A young girl whose hands had shifted from her lap to her sides. An elderly man whose previously closed mouth now appeared slightly open, as if caught midward. As I studied the images, a cold unease settled in my stomach. If these changes were real, and not some elaborate prank or optical illusion, it defied everything I knew about photographic processes. There's more, Eleanor said, lowering her voice though we were alone in the office. The night guard has been hearing things. Whispers coming from the exhibition hall after hours. And one of our conservators claimed she saw movement out of the corner of her eye while working with the collection. Movement in the photographs? I asked incredulously. She wouldn't say exactly. She requested a transfer to another department the next day. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun was setting, casting the office in a reddish glow that made the comparative images on the screen look even more eerie. Eleanor, there has to be a rational explanation. Maybe there's some slow chemical reaction occurring within the plates, or... I know what you're thinking, she interrupted. That I'm an overworked academic imagining things. But I need you to do something for me. Stay tonight. After hours. Help me document whatever is happening. I wanted to refuse. Every rational bone in my body told me this was absurd. But the earnestness in Eleanor's eyes, and my own curiosity about those subtle, impossible changes made me nod in agreement. I'll stay, I said. As the words left my mouth, I could have sworn I heard a soft sigh coming from the direction of the exhibition hall, like the collective exhalation of dozens of long-held breaths. Little did I know that by morning, my understanding of photography and of history itself would be irrevocably changed. The museum after closing hours was a different world. The grand spaces that during the day buzzed with visitors' conversations and footsteps now amplified every small sound, the settling of the old building, the distant hum of climate control systems, the occasional creak of century-old floorboards expanding and contracting. Eleanor had arranged for the night security guard, a retired police officer named Marcus, to give us access to the special collections room while maintaining his regular rounds of the building. At 11:30, we sat in the dimly lit exhibition space, surrounded by the faces of people long dead, with only the soft glow of Eleanor's laptop screen illuminating our anxious faces. I've set up time-lapse photography on 3 of the most dramatically changed pieces, she explained, typing commands into her computer. High-resolution cameras will take 1 frame every 30 seconds throughout the night. If anything changes, we'll have documentation. I nodded, though I was still struggling to believe we would capture anything beyond the gradual settling of dust. Which pieces are you monitoring? Lieutenant Harper, Catherine Dunleavy, and this one. She gestured toward a small daguerreotype of a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, holding what appeared to be a toy soldier. Thomas Wellington, son of a Massachusetts state senator, died of tuberculosis in 1853. I moved closer to examine the image. The boy's face had the serious expression common in 19th century portraiture, but something about his eyes seemed unusually aware, almost adult-like in their intensity. What changes have you observed in this one? I asked. His hands, Eleanor said quietly. When we received the collection, the toy soldier was in his right hand. Now it's in his left. And his head was tilted more to the right before. I peered closer at the silver surface. These cases, do you know anything about their provenance before the Wellesley estate acquired them? Eleanor shook her head. The collection passed through several hands. The Welsleys were merely the last private owners. They claimed some distant relation to several of the subjects, but the documentation was sparse. As we spoke, I became aware of a subtle change in the room's temperature. Despite the carefully controlled climate system, a noticeable chill had crept into the air. I rubbed my arms, trying to dispel the goosebumps that had formed there. "Do you feel that?" I asked. Eleanor nodded, her eyes widening slightly. "It happens sometimes while I'm alone with them. The temperature drops, especially around certain photographs." "Which ones?" "The soldiers, mainly. The ones who died violently." I was about to dismiss this as suggestibility when a soft, barely audible sound reached my ears, something between a whisper and a sigh, coming from the direction of the display cases. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eleanor nodded, her face pale in the dim light. We sat in tense silence for several minutes, straining to hear. The sound didn't repeat, but the temperature continued to drop until I could see our breath forming small clouds in the air. "This is scientifically impossible," I muttered, more to reassure myself than to make a point. "There must be an issue with the climate control system." "Look," Eleanor said suddenly, pointing to the laptop screen. The time-lapse feed showed Lieutenant Harper's photograph. As we watched, a subtle movement occurred, so slight that if you blinked, you would miss it. The lieutenant's eyes, which had been looking to the side, slowly shifted until they seemed to be staring directly at the camera. "That's not possible," I whispered, my scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of what I was seeing. "Keep watching," Eleanor urged. Over the next several minutes, more subtle changes occurred. Catherine Dunleavy's almost smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep sadness. The boy's toy soldier seemed to slip lower in his grip. "We need to document this properly," I said, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding my growing unease. "Do you have a thermometer? An EMF meter? Anything we can use to measure these environmental changes?" "In my office," Eleanor replied. "I'll go get them. Will you be okay here alone for a few minutes?" I nodded, though my heart rate had accelerated noticeably. As Eleanor's footsteps receded down the corridor, I turned back to study the photographs, particularly Lieutenant Harper's increasingly disturbed expression. "What are you trying to tell us?" I whispered to the image. A sudden sharp crack made me jump. It took me a moment to realize it was just the old building settling. But in that moment of startled alertness, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins, reflections in the glass of the display cases. Reflections of people who weren't in the room. They were faint, ghostly silhouettes standing behind me, but when I spun around, there was only empty space. When I looked back at the glass, the reflections were gone. My hands trembled as I reached for Eleanor's laptop, checking the time-lapse footage. Had the camera captured what I'd seen? As I reviewed the most recent frames, my breath caught in my throat. In one frame, just one, there appeared to be a man in a Civil War uniform standing behind me, his face a blur of motion. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Eleanor's return. She hurried in, arms full of equipment, face flushed with excitement. "The strangest thing just happened," she said breathlessly. All the lights in my office started flickering, and my computer turned on by itself. The screen was filled with text. It looked like a letter. "What did it say?" I asked, my mouth dry. I couldn't read most of it before it disappeared, but it was signed Lt. J. Harper and dated September 16, 1862. "Philip, that's the day before he died at Antietam." As she spoke, the temperature plummeted further. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of indistinct voices that seemed to emanate from the photographs themselves. Eleanor set up her equipment with shaking hands, a digital thermometer, an EMF meter borrowed from a paranormal research group that had once requested access to the museum, and a high-quality audio recorder. "Temperature is 47 degrees, she announced, reading from the digital display. "That's nearly 30 degrees below the controlled setting." The EMF meter lit up like a Christmas tree, its needle swinging wildly as she moved it near the display cases. "Something is definitely happening," I murmured, my scientific mind struggling to process what my senses were telling me. "Some kind of energy is being generated or transferred." Then came a sound that made both of us freeze, a child's laughter, clear and distinct, coming from directly behind us. We turned in unison to find only empty space. "Thomas?" Eleanor called softly, her eyes fixed on the daguerreotype of a young boy. As if in response, the audio recorder emitted a burst of static, followed by a few seconds of what sounded like a child's voice, too faint and distorted to make out the words. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved closer to the boy's photograph. The toy soldier in his hand had definitely moved, now clutched against his chest rather than held loosely at his side as it had been minutes earlier. "They're trying to communicate," Eleanor whispered. "All this time, they've been trying to tell us something." As if to confirm her words, a new sound filled the room, the unmistakable crack of distant gunfire, followed by shouting voices. The sounds weren't coming from outside the museum or from any identifiable source within. They seemed to exist in the air itself, surrounding us like an auditory hallucination shared between two people. The laptop screen flickered, and when it stabilized, the time-lapse view had changed. Instead of showing the museum display case, it showed what appeared to be a battlefield, a smoky, chaotic scene of men in blue uniforms charging across an open field. "Antietam," I whispered, recognizing the scene from historical photographs I'd studied. As we watched in horrified fascination, the camera seemed to focus on one soldier in particular, Lieutenant Harper, his face a match for the daguerreotype we'd been observing. He was running, rifle in hand, when suddenly he jerked backward, a bloom of red appearing on his chest. The screen went black, then returned to the normal time-lapse view of the museum display case. But Lieutenant Harper's photograph had changed again. Now blood stained his uniform where moments before it had been pristine. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. "My God, Philip, what's happening?" Before I could respond, the lights in the room began to flicker wildly. The whispers grew to a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, all desperate to be heard. The temperature dropped so low that frost began to form on the glass of the display cases. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights stabilized, the temperature began to rise, and the voices fell silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the steady hum of Eleanor's equipment. We looked at each other, then at the photographs. They had all changed. Lieutenant Harper now stared directly at us, blood still visible on his uniform. Catherine Dunleavy's face was streaked with tears. The boy, Thomas, had dropped his toy soldier entirely. It lay at his feet in the photograph. "They're showing us how they died," Eleanor said, her voice hollow with shock. "Not just the soldiers. All of them. They're showing us their last moments." As she spoke, I noticed something on the floor beneath the display case, a small, folded piece of yellowed paper that hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and carefully unfolded it. Inside was handwriting in faded brown ink. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then I have fallen in battle as I feared I would. Please know that my last thoughts were of you and our son. There is something I must confess before I face whatever judgment awaits me. The rest of the letter was too faded to read, except for the signature at the bottom, "Forever yours, James Harper." I handed the letter to Eleanor, who read it with widening eyes. "This is impossible," she whispered. "This paper is over 150 years old, but it materialized in front of us." "I think," I said slowly, my mind struggling to form a coherent theory, "that these photographs have somehow become portals. Not just images of the past, but actual connections to it." Eleanor nodded, a look of realization dawning on her face. "That's why they're changing. We're not just seeing photographs anymore. We're seeing through to the actual moments of these people's lives and deaths." As the night wore on, more changes occurred. More whispers reached our ears. More artifacts appeared, a button from a Union soldier's uniform, a lace handkerchief embroidered with Catherine Dunleavy's initials, a tiny lead toy soldier. By dawn, we had filled Eleanor's laptop with recordings, measurements, and photographic evidence of a phenomenon that defied scientific explanation. We had also filled several pages with fragments of stories, pieces of lives long ended but somehow still accessible through the silver and glass of these antique photographs. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the museum windows, I looked again at Lieutenant Harper's image. His expression had changed once more. The fear and pain were gone, replaced by a look of peace, perhaps even gratitude. "They just wanted to be remembered," Eleanor said softly, following my gaze. "Not as frozen images, but as people who lived and loved and suffered." I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. My world had been turned upside down in a single night. Everything I thought I knew about physics, about history, about the barrier between past and present had been challenged. But one thing was clear: these photographs were far more than mere images. They were windows into lives cut short, into stories untold. And they weren't finished telling those stories yet. Morning brought no clarity, only questions that multiplied with each passing hour. Eleanor and I had barely spoken as we packed up the equipment, both of us processing what we'd witnessed. Marcus, the night guard, had checked on us several times throughout our vigil but had seen nothing unusual, a fact that only deepened the mystery. Were these phenomena selective in who could perceive them? By 9 o'clock, the museum staff began arriving, forcing us to adopt a veneer of normalcy. Eleanor informed them she was conducting special conservation work with me, a consulting expert, and asked not to be disturbed. Once alone in her office, we spread our evidence across her desk: the audio recordings, the temperature and EMF readings, the time-lapse footage, and the physical artifacts that had materialized from seemingly nowhere. "We need to research the subjects of these photographs," I said, examining Lieutenant Harper's letter for the third time. "If these are indeed portals to their lives, there must be a reason these particular individuals are reaching through time." Eleanor nodded, already typing at her computer. "I've been combing through the museum's acquisition records. The Wellesley family donated the collection after the death of Margaret Wellesley, the last of the direct line. She was 97 when she passed away 6 months ago. Any connection between her and the subjects?" I asked. "That's what's interesting," Eleanor replied, turning the screen toward me. "According to these notes from the initial donation meeting, Margaret claimed to be a descendant of both the Harpers and the Dunleavys. She said the collection had been in her family for generations, passed down as a sacred trust." "Sacred trust," I repeated. Interesting choice of words. Eleanor pulled up another document. "There's more." The museum director noted that Margaret was insistent that the collection be displayed together and not separated. She said, and I quote, "They need each other." They're connected in ways you wouldn't understand. A chill ran down my spine, unrelated to any supernatural temperature drop. Did she know about the changes? I don't know, but I intend to find out. Eleanor reached for her phone. Margaret Wellesley lived in a nursing home for the last decade of her life. I'm going to call and see if any of her personal effects ended up there, or if she had any regular visitors who might know more. While Eleanor made her calls, I examined the artifacts we'd collected. The button from Lieutenant Harper's uniform was tarnished but still showed the insignia of the Massachusetts Infantry. The handkerchief was delicate, the embroidered initials CD surrounded by tiny, perfect stitches. The lead toy soldier was crude by modern standards but showed remarkable detail for something made in the mid-19th century. As I held the toy soldier up to the light, I noticed something etched into its base, tiny letters that spelled out TW. Thomas Wellington's initials. These weren't mass-produced, I murmured to myself. These were personal possessions. Eleanor hung up the phone, her expression animated. I've found something. Margaret Wellesley had a regular visitor at the nursing home, a granddaughter named Olivia Parker. She lives right here in Boston. I have her number. 20 minutes later, we were in my car heading toward Cambridge, where Olivia Parker had agreed to meet us at a small cafe near Harvard Square. As we drove, Eleanor filled me in on what little she'd learned during their brief conversation. Olivia said her grandmother was intensely protective of the photograph collection. She would talk to them sometimes when she thought no one was listening. The family assumed it was dementia, but maybe she knew exactly who she was talking to, I finished. Olivia Parker turned out to be a poised woman in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor. She'd secured a quiet table in the corner of the cafe, away from other patrons. You said this was about my grandmother's photograph collection, she began after introductions. Has something happened to it? Eleanor and I exchanged glances, unsure how much to reveal. The collection is safe, Eleanor assured her. But we've noticed some unusual characteristics that we're trying to understand. Your grandmother seemed quite insistent that the photographs be kept together. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of unusual characteristics? I decided direct honesty might be our best approach. Miss Parker, this will sound incredible, but we've observed the photographs changing. The expressions, the positions of the subjects, they're different from day to day. Last night, we documented these changes occurring in real time. I expected disbelief, maybe even concern about her mental health. Instead, Olivia closed her eyes briefly, a look of profound relief washing over her face. So it wasn't just Grandma, she whispered. And it wasn't just me. Eleanor leaned forward. You seen it too? Olivia nodded, opening her purse to remove a small leather-bound journal. Grandma kept journals her entire life. When she died, I found this one hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box. It documents the changes she observed over decades. She slid the journal across the table. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully to find neat, meticulous handwriting detailing dates, specific photographs, and observed changes. May 14, 1976, Lieutenant Harper looking left today instead of right. Anniversary of Emily's death. December 25th, 1980, Thomas smiling today. First time ever. Christmas making him happy even beyond the veil. April 3rd, 1991, Catherine crying again. The anniversary of her son's drowning. Page after page documented similar observations spanning nearly 50 years. Your grandmother kept track of these changes for half a century, I said, amazed. Olivia nodded. And her mother before her, though those journals were lost in a fire in the 60s. It's been a family responsibility for generations. Responsibility? Eleanor questioned. To witness, Olivia said simply. Grandma believed they needed someone to see them, to acknowledge their continued existence. She called it keeping faith with the dead. But why these particular people? I asked. What connects them? Olivia hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Have you heard of the Wellington Seance Society? Eleanor and I both shook our heads. It was a group formed in Boston in 1851 by Senator William Wellington, Thomas's father, after his wife died in childbirth. The senator became obsessed with spiritualism, with finding ways to communicate with the dead. He gathered like-minded individuals, including Catherine Dunleavy and Lieutenant Harper's wife, Emily. They were trying to contact the dead, Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Not just contact them, Olivia corrected. According to family lore, they were trying to create permanent pathways between the worlds of the living and the dead. And they believed photography was the key. I thought about the daguerreotype process, how it had seemed magical even to those who understood the science behind it, the way an image could be captured on a silver-coated copper plate through the action of light and chemicals. They thought photographs could be portals, I said. Olivia nodded. The society commissioned a photographer named Frederick Holloway to create special plates using a modified process. They believed that by exposing the plates during their seances, and by incorporating certain materials into the photographic chemicals, they could create images that would serve as permanent connections to the spirits of their loved ones. And did it work? Eleanor asked. Not at first. But then the society members themselves began to die. Thomas from tuberculosis. Catherine's husband in a shipping accident. And after Antietam, Lieutenant Harper. Their photographs, taken with Holloway's special process, began to show the changes my ancestors documented. So these aren't just photographs of the dead, I said slowly. They're photographs of people who were actively trying to pierce the veil between life and death. And succeeded, Olivia added. At least partially. Eleanor frowned. But why donate the collection to the museum after all this time? If your family has been keeping faith for generations, why stop now? A shadow passed over Olivia's face. Grandma believed they were getting stronger. The changes were becoming more frequent, more dramatic. And there were incidents. What kind of incidents? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Objects moving. Voices when no one was there. Once, my grandmother found her entire living room rearranged overnight. She was living alone at the time. Olivia paused. In her last coherent conversation with me, she said she was afraid they were trying to come through completely. An image flashed in my mind, the ghostly reflection I'd seen in the display case glass, the blurred figure in Civil War uniform captured for a single frame on Eleanor's camera. How is that even possible? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Olivia shrugged helplessly. I don't know the mechanics of it. Neither did Grandma. But she believed that after a century and a half of existing between worlds, they'd learned to manipulate the connection, to widen the portal. I thought about the artifacts that had materialized in the museum, physical objects that had crossed from the past into the present. If inanimate objects could make the journey, what about the people themselves? Your grandmother donated the collection to shift the responsibility, I realized. to make it someone else's problem. She was scared, Olivia admitted, and tired. The burden had worn her down. In her more lucid moments, she thought public institution might be safer, more eyes watching, more people to notice if something went wrong. And in her less lucid moments, Eleanor pressed. Olivia's expression darkened. She talked about destroying them, burning the whole collection. But she was afraid of what might happen if she tried, afraid they wouldn't let her. The implications hung heavy in the air between us. These weren't just haunted objects, they were potentially dangerous ones with wills and agendas of their own. We need to see your grandmother's full records, I said. And we need to learn more about Frederick Holloway's photographic process. Olivia nodded. I have boxes of her papers at my apartment. As for Holloway, there might be clues in the journals. Grandma was meticulous about recording family history. As we prepared to leave, Olivia gripped my arm suddenly, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. Be careful, she warned, her voice low and urgent. Grandma believed they weren't all benevolent. Some of them are angry about their deaths. Some want revenge. And some just want to live again, whatever the cost. The drive to Olivia's apartment in Cambridge was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The rational part of my mind still struggled to accept what we were experiencing, but the evidence was becoming too substantial to dismiss. Olivia's apartment was a small but elegant space filled with books and antiques. She led us to her study, where several cardboard boxes were stacked against one wall. These are all of Grandma's papers relating to the collection, she explained, removing the lid from the topmost box. Family histories, journal entries, research she conducted over the years. We spent the next several hours sifting through the materials, yellowed newspaper clippings, typed manuscripts, handwritten notes spanning decades. The more we read, the clearer the picture became. The Wellington Seance Society had been more than a group of grieving family members seeking comfort. They had been systematic in their approach, combining elements of traditional spiritualism with emerging technologies and even alchemical practices. Frederick Holloway, their photographer, had studied chemistry in Europe and had experimented with adding unusual substances to his photographic chemicals, including, according to one journal entry, a tincture of wormwood and powdered bone. They were creating a hybrid science, Eleanor murmured as she read through Holloway's notes. Part chemistry, part mysticism. And it worked, I added, examining a series of dated daguerreotypes showing the gradual transformation of Catherine Dunleavy's expression over a period of years. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn to a small leather case tucked inside one of the boxes. Unlike the other materials, which were organized and labeled, this seemed deliberately hidden beneath layers of mundane papers. Inside was a single daguerreotype, a group portrait of 13 people, men and women dressed in the formal attire of the mid-19th century, arranged in a semicircle around a small table draped in dark cloth. On the table was what appeared to be a photographic plate. The Wellington Seance Society, Olivia confirmed, looking over my shoulder. That's Senator Wellington in the center. Catherine Dunleavy is seated to his right. Emily Harper, the lieutenant's wife, is on the left. When was this taken? I asked. 1856, according to Grandma's notes. Before most of them died. I studied the faces carefully. They looked ordinary enough, serious, as was common in photographs of that era, but not particularly sinister or unusual. Yet something about the image made my skin crawl. Is it my imagination? Eleanor asked, leaning closer, or are their eyes unusually clear for a daguerreotype of this period? She was right. In most photographs from this era, eyes often appear dark or unfocused due to the long exposure times. But in this image, every person's eyes were startlingly clear, almost luminous. "It's one of Holloway's special plates," Olivia explained. Grandma believed this was the first successful attempt the moment they established the initial connection. As I continued to study the image, a detail caught my attention, a blur area behind the group, a sort of smudge that didn't match the otherwise sharp quality of the photograph. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to the anomaly. Olivia peered at it, then shrugged. "I'm not sure. Grandma never mentioned it." I took out my pocket loupe and examined the area more closely. As the magnification brought the detail into focus, my blood ran cold. The smudge wasn't a photographic flaw or a shadow. It was a face, a distorted, spectral face pressing against what seemed to be an invisible barrier, its mouth open in what might have been a scream or a plea. "My God," I whispered. "They didn't just create a portal for the dead to reach the living." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I said, my voice unsteady, "that from the very beginning, something was trying to get through from the other side. Something that might not have been human at all." We returned to the museum after dark, armed with Olivia's grandmother's journals and a growing sense of dread about what we might be facing. Olivia had insisted on accompanying us, claiming that her family's long stewardship of the photographs gave her insights we might need. My grandmother could sense when they were most active, she explained as we made our way through the eerily quiet corridors. Certain times, certain conditions seemed to strengthen the connection. "Such as?" Eleanor asked. "Anniversaries of deaths, emotional resonance, and darkness, always more activity after sunset." The special collections room felt different tonight, charged with a subtle energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. We had brought more sophisticated equipment this time, high-definition cameras with infrared capabilities, more sensitive audio recorders, and a spectral analysis device borrowed from a physics lab at MIT where one of Eleanor's former students now worked. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with," I said as I set up the equipment. "If these photographs are indeed portals, we need to know how stable they are, how controllable, and most importantly, what's on the other side. And how to close them if necessary," Eleanor added quietly. Olivia moved slowly around the display cases, her fingers hovering just above the glass as if sensing the energy emanating from each photograph. She stopped before Lieutenant Harper's image, her expression troubled. "He's agitated tonight," she murmured. "Something's different." I moved to her side, examining the photograph. The lieutenant's expression had indeed changed again. His eyes were wider now, his jaw set in a way that suggested tension or alarm. "Is he trying to warn us?" I wondered aloud. "Perhaps," Olivia replied. "Or perhaps he's reacting to something we can't see." Eleanor joined us, her tablet in hand. "I've been cross-referencing the dates in Margaret's journals with historical records. There's a pattern to when the changes are most pronounced." "What kind of pattern?" I asked. "Celestial events. Full moons, eclipses, equinoxes. The most dramatic changes occurred during these times." Olivia nodded slowly. "Grandma used to get anxious during full moons. She'd stay up all night, watching the collection." I checked my phone. "Tonight's not a full moon." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But it is the anniversary of the Battle of Antietam." A chill ran through me. The day Lieutenant Harper died. As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered briefly. The temperature began its now familiar drop, the air growing cold enough to make our breath visible. "It's starting," Olivia whispered. We took our positions around the room, monitoring different aspects of the phenomenon. Eleanor focused on the environmental readings, Olivia on the photographs themselves, while I operated the cameras and audio equipment. The first changes were subtle, slight alterations in expressions, positions, the play of light and shadow within the images. But as the hours crept past midnight, the phenomena intensified. The whispers returned, growing louder and more distinct until we could make out fragments of sentences, snippets of conversations from another time. "Told you not to go. The letter must reach. Beyond the veil, they wait." The spectral analysis device beeped continuously, its display showing energy fluctuations that, according to its programming, shouldn't have been possible. Around 1 a.m, something new happened. As I focused the infrared camera on Catherine Dunleavy's photograph, the image on my monitor began to shift. The formal posed portrait dissolved, replaced by what appeared to be a moving scene, Catherine in a darkened room, seated at a writing desk, her face illuminated by candlelight as she wrote frantically on a sheet of paper. "Are you seeing this?" I called to the others. They rushed to my side, watching in astonishment as the scene played out like a window into the past. We could see Catherine glance nervously over her shoulder, as if afraid of being discovered. She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, then moved to a bookshelf where she slid the letter behind a row of volumes. Then the image shifted again, showing the same room but in daylight. A maid was dusting the bookshelf when several volumes fell, revealing the hidden letter. The maid picked it up, examined it with a puzzled expression, then pocketed it rather than returning it to its hiding place. "She's showing us something important," Olivia whispered. "Something about a letter that was never delivered." As suddenly as it had appeared, the moving scene vanished, replaced once more by the static daguerreotype. But Catherine's expression had changed dramatically, her eyes now filled with an urgent pleading. "I think she wants us to find that letter," Eleanor said. "But how? This happened over 150 years ago." Before we could discuss it further, another photograph began to change, Thomas Wellington's. The boy's image shifted and blurred, and when it stabilized, he was no longer alone in the frame. A tall, severe-looking man stood behind him, one hand gripping the boy's shoulder tightly. "Senator Wellington," Olivia identified. "Thomas's father." The senator's expression was cold, calculating, with none of the grief or spiritual yearning I would have expected from a man who had founded a seance society to contact his dead wife. As we watched, the scene within the photograph began to move again. We saw the senator lead Thomas into what appeared to be a basement room lit by gas lamps. Other adults were present, forming a circle around a central table covered with strange symbols. Thomas's face registered clear terror as his father placed him at the center of the circle. The boy's lips moved, forming words we couldn't hear. "They're using him," Olivia said, horrified. "Using his connection to his dead mother." The scene shifted again, showing Thomas confined to a bed, his face flushed with fever, while the senator sat nearby taking notes with clinical detachment. "My God," Eleanor whispered. This wasn't just a spiritual practice for them. They were experimenting. On their own children, I added, sickened by the implication. The image reverted to its original state, but Thomas's eyes now held a knowledge and sorrow no child should possess. A sharp crackling sound drew our attention to Lieutenant Harper's photograph. The glass of the display case had developed a hairline crack that spread slowly across its surface, though we had touched nothing. "Something's happening," Olivia warned, backing away from the case. "Something different." The crack continued to spread until, with a sound like breaking ice, the entire glass front of the display case shattered. Yet instead of falling to the floor, the fragments hung suspended in midair for a long, impossible moment before slowly reassembling themselves into a different shape, a kind of window or frame floating before the photograph. Through this impossible window, we could see a battlefield. Smoke hung heavy in the air, the distant thunder of cannon fire punctuating the eerie silence of our museum space. And there, moving through the smoke, was Lieutenant Harper, alive and solid, looking directly at us across the gulf of time. His lips moved, forming words. This time, we could hear them, faint but distinct. "They're coming through. You have to stop them." "Who?" I called out, my scientific detachment forgotten in the face of this impossible conversation. "Who's coming through?" "The others," Harper replied, his voice growing stronger. "The ones who were never photographed. The ones who wait in the darkness between." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "I don't understand." "What others?" Harper's form flickered, like a television with poor reception. "We didn't know what we were doing. We thought we were creating pathways to our loved ones. But we opened doors to something else." Behind Harper, the battlefield seemed darkened, the smoke thickening into unnatural, writhing shadows. Forms moved within those shadows, forms that seemed only vaguely human. "The Society's work," Harper continued urgently. "It didn't just connect us to the other side. It weakened the barrier between worlds. Every change in our images, every object that crosses over, it widens the breach. How do we stop it?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the impossibility of the situation. "Find Holloway's formula. Reverse it." Harper's image was fading, the shadows behind him pressing closer. "The letter. Catherine's letter. It contains..." His words were cut off as one of the shadow forms lunged forward, passing through Harper's fading image and striking the window of suspended glass. The makeshift portal shuddered, its edges blurring. "Get back!" Olivia shouted, pulling Eleanor and me away from the display case. The window of glass fragments imploded with a sound like 1,000 wind chimes, the pieces flying not outward but inward toward the photograph. As they vanished, something else began to emerge, a hand, grayish and corpse-like, reaching out from the photograph's surface into our world. I grabbed the nearest object, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, and discharged it directly at the emerging form. The cold cloud of chemicals enveloped the hand, which recoiled back into the photograph with a sound like a distant scream. "The lights!" Eleanor shouted, rushing to the wall switch. "They retreat from strong light." She flipped on every switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent illumination. The phenomena receded, the whispers fading, the temperature rising, the photographs returning to their static state. We stood in shocked silence for several minutes, processing what we had witnessed. The display case that had contained Lieutenant Harper's photograph was intact again, showing no sign of the shattering we had all seen. But the photograph itself had changed. Harper's expression was now one of grim determination, and behind him, barely visible but unmistakably present, were the shadowy forms we had glimpsed through the portal. "We need to find Catherine's letter," I said finally, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "And Holloway's formula. And we need to do it quickly," Olivia added, her face pale. "The breach is widening. Tonight proved that." Eleanor nodded, her scientific skepticism now completely abandoned in the face of undeniable evidence. "The connections between their world and ours are strengthening. If they can reach through physically, then eventually they'll come through completely," I finished. As we gathered our equipment, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had witnessed, I noticed something on the floor beneath Thomas Wellington's photograph, a small piece of paper that hadn't been there before. I picked it up carefully. It was a page torn from what appeared to be a child's diary, the handwriting neat but clearly that of a young person. Father says I am special because I can see Mother when the others cannot. The men in his society ask me questions about her, but I do not tell them everything. I do not tell them about the dark things that come with her, the things that hide behind her and watch me with hungry eyes. Father would be angry if he knew I was keeping secrets, but Mother warned me not to tell. She said the dark things are growing stronger every time Father performs his experiments. She said soon they won't need us to see through to our world. They'll walk through on their own. The date at the top of the page was September 12, 1853. Thomas Wellington had died 3 days later. I showed the page to the others, a growing sense of urgency building inside me. We're not just dealing with ghosts or spirits, I said. According to this, the Wellington Society accidentally opened a door to something much darker. And now that door is opening wider, Eleanor added grimly. As we left the museum in the gray light of dawn, I couldn't shake the image of that grayish hand reaching through from the photograph, or Lieutenant Harper's desperate warning. The Wellesley family had kept faith with these photographs for generations, watching over them, documenting the changes. But they had never truly understood what they were guarding against. Now that responsibility had fallen to us. And we had very little time to learn what Catherine's hidden letter contained, what Holloway's formula was, and how to reverse a process that had been strengthening for over a century and a half. Because if we failed, the darkness waiting on the other side of those antique photographs would finally break through completely. And I had the terrible feeling that our world was utterly unprepared for what would follow. The search for Catherine Dunleavy's letter consumed the next 48 hours. Olivia combed through her grandmother's papers while Eleanor and I searched historical archives and property records, trying to determine what had become of Catherine's home and possessions after her death in 1867. If the maid took the letter but didn't deliver it, it might still exist somewhere, Eleanor reasoned as we pored over dusty ledgers in the Boston Historical Society. Perhaps in a family collection, or donated to an archive. Our breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a footnote in a doctoral dissertation about domestic service in 19th century Boston. The author mentioned a collection of papers belonging to one Mary Sullivan, a housemaid who had served several prominent families, including the Dunleavys. The papers, including personal correspondence never sent or received, had been donated to a small historical museum in South Boston. The curator of the South Boston Heritage Museum was initially reluctant to allow us access to the uncatalogued collection, but Eleanor's museum credentials and a persuasive story about researching the social history of domestic workers eventually gained us entry to their storage room. The letter was there, still in its original envelope, sealed with wax that had never been broken. The address on the front was simply Frederick, with no surname or location. Frederick Holloway, I murmured, carefully breaking the seal. Catherine was trying to reach the photographer. The letter, written in faded ink on yellow paper, confirmed our worst fears. My dear Frederick, I write to you in greatest urgency and secrecy. What we have done through your photographic process has exceeded all our expectations, but I fear we have been terribly naive. The connections we sought with our departed loved ones have indeed been established, but they are not the only ones using the pathways we have opened. Last night during our session, while the others were focused on the table, I saw something in the silver mirror that filled me with indescribable dread. There were forms behind Elizabeth's spirit, dark, hungry things that seemed to be using her image as a mask or doorway. While I tried to warn William, He dismissed my concerns, saying only that some discomfort was to be expected when breaching the veil between worlds. But this was not mere discomfort, Frederick. This was malevolence. I am convinced that our attempts to connect with our loved ones have unintentionally opened pathways for entities that should remain forever separate from our world. You must alter your formula. The combination of silver nitrate with the essence of belladonna and the other substances William insisted upon, these create not just an image but a tear in the fabric between worlds. A tear that is widening with each passing day. I have taken the liberty of experimenting with your chemicals in secret. I believe that reversing the process requires the application of a solution of silver iodide and pure spring water exposed to direct sunlight rather than darkness upon the original plates. This should seal what we have inadvertently opened. Please come at once to assist me in this endeavor. William grows more obsessed each day, and I fear what he intends for young Thomas, whose sensitivity to the other side makes him particularly vulnerable. With deepest concern, Catherine Dunleavy. She knew, Eleanor whispered. She understood the danger and found a solution. But the letter was never delivered, Olivia said. And Catherine died before she could implement her plan. I carefully photographed the letter, then returned it to its envelope. We have our formula now. We need to try what she suggested. But we don't have Holloway's original chemicals, Eleanor pointed out. And the formula mentions substances William Wellington insisted upon without specifying what they were. I think I know where we might find that information, Olivia said. In the margins of my grandmother's oldest journal, there are chemical formulas that never made sense to me. I assumed they were some kind of code, but what if they're Holloway's original notes? Our return to the museum that evening was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Armed with Catherine's letter and the chemical formulas from Margaret Wellesley's journal, we felt closer to a solution. But we also knew that time was running short. The night before, the museum's security cameras had captured strange anomalies, moving shadows where no one stood, brief glimpses of figures that appeared and vanished between frames. The barrier was weakening, and whatever waited on the other side was growing bolder. Eleanor had made arrangements for the museum to be closed early, citing the need for special conservation work on the Wellesley collection. With the building emptied of staff and visitors, we set up our equipment once more in the special collections room. If Catherine was right, I explained as I prepared the solution of silver iodide she had described. Applying this to the photographs while exposed to direct sunlight should reverse Holloway's process and seal the breaches. But it's night, Olivia pointed out. And these are irreplaceable historical artifacts. If we make a mistake, we can use high-intensity UV lamps, Eleanor suggested. They simulate sunlight closely enough that they're used in conservation treatments. And we can test the solution on a small corner of one photograph first, I added. We set up the UV lamps, positioning them to focus on Lieutenant Harper's photograph, the one that had shown the most dramatic changes and attempted breakthroughs. With trembling hands, I prepared to apply a drop of Catherine's solution to a tiny corner of the daguerreotype. Before the dropper could touch the surface, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into darkness broken only by the faint emergency exit signs. Power failure? Olivia whispered. No, Eleanor replied, her voice tight with fear. Look at the photographs. In the near darkness, the daguerreotypes had begun to glow with a faint, silvery light. Not a reflection of ambient light, but a luminescence emanating from within the images themselves. And in that ghostly illumination, the faces were changing, not in the subtle ways we had observed before, but dramatically, horrifically. Lieutenant Harper's features contorted in a silent scream of warning. Catherine Dunleavy's face seemed to melt away, revealing another countenance behind it, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a lipless mouth stretched in a grotesque parody of a smile. Thomas Wellington's boyish visage transformed into something ancient and malevolent, his eyes becoming black pits in a silvery glow. "They know what we're trying to do," Olivia gasped. "They're fighting back." A low humming filled the air, rising in pitch until it became a cacophony of discordant whispers. The temperature plummeted until frost formed on the display cases, spreading in intricate patterns across the glass. And then the glass began to crack, not just one case, but all of them simultaneously. Hairline fractures spread like spider webs, connecting and expanding until each case was a lattice of broken glass held together only by some impossible tension. "Get back!" I shouted, pulling Eleanor and Olivia away from the displays. The cases exploded outward, showering the room with glass fragments that hung suspended in the air like a crystalline constellation. Through this glittering veil, we could see the photographs changing, their two-dimensional surfaces rippling like disturbed water. And then, impossibly, hands began to emerge, pale, spectral hands reaching out from the photographs into our world. But these were not the hands of Lieutenant Harper or Catherine Dunleavy or any of the human subjects. These were something else, elongated fingers ending in claws, skin like ancient parchment stretched over bone. "The UV lamps," Eleanor cried. "We need light." I fumbled in the darkness for the backup generator switch, finding it by touch alone. With a mechanical groan, the generator kicked in, and the UV lamps flickered to life, bathing the room in harsh, artificial daylight. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The emerging forms recoiled from the light, retreating partially back into the photographs. But they didn't withdraw completely. Instead, they seemed to adapt, their substance becoming more solid, more present in our reality with each passing second. "The solution," I called to Olivia. "Bring it quickly." She grabbed the vial of silver iodide solution and tossed it to me. As I caught it, one of the creatures, I could no longer think of them as mere images or spirits, lunged from Thomas Wellington's photograph, its form now almost fully materialized, a tall, emaciated humanoid with skin like tarnished silver and eyes that reflected the UV light like a cat's. Eleanor swung a metal stool at the creature, connecting with a sound like striking hollow metal. The thing stumbled back, but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound between a hiss and static electricity, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. "Philip, hurry!" Olivia screamed, using her jacket to fend off another partially emerged entity. With shaking hands, I uncapped the vial and splashed the solution directly onto Lieutenant Harper's photograph. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the silver surface began to bubble and smoke, the image distorting as it viewed through heat waves. A howl of rage and pain filled the room, not from Harper's image, but from the dark entities emerging from the other photographs. They thrashed more violently, pushing harder against the barrier between worlds. "It's working!" Eleanor shouted. "Do the others." I moved as quickly as I dared, applying Catherine's solution to each photograph in turn. With each application, the silver surfaces bubbled and the entities reacted with increasing fury. But they also seemed to weaken, their forms becoming less substantial, the boundaries of the photographs more defined and impermeable. As I applied the solution to the final photograph, Catherine Dunleavy's own portrait, the room filled with a deafening chorus of inhuman shrieks. The entities, now caught between our world and theirs, twisted and contorted in ways that defied anatomy and physics. Their silvery forms began to break apart, like mercury separating into beads, each droplet pulled back toward the photographs that had been their gateways. Look. Olivia pointed at Lieutenant Harper's daguerreotype. Within the frame, Harper's expression had changed once more. The terror was gone from his face, replaced with a look of profound relief. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude, before his image settled into stillness. Not the unnatural stillness of a photograph, but the peaceful repose of someone finally finding rest. One by one, the other human subjects in the photographs underwent similar transformations. Catherine Dunleavy's face softened into a gentle smile. Thomas Wellington's boyish features relaxed, losing the haunted quality that had characterized them for over a century and a half. But the entities, the ones who were never photographed, as Harper had called them, fought against the silver iodide solution with desperate fury. The partially materialized creatures that had made it into our world began to dissolve, their substance drawn inexorably back toward the photographs. They left behind nothing but a lingering cold and the acrid smell of tarnished silver. The suspended glass fragments from the shattered display cases hung in the air for one impossible moment longer before gravity reasserted itself. The glass fell harmlessly to the floor, away from us, as if guided by an unseen hand. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear only our own labored breathing and the steady hum of the UV lamps. "It's done," Eleanor whispered, staring at the photographs. "Look at them." The daguerreotypes had changed fundamentally. The silver surfaces no longer held that peculiar depth that had characterized them before. They were simply what they appeared to be, 19th century photographs, remarkable for their age and historical significance, but nothing more. The portal between worlds had closed. Holloway's formula reversed, I said, picking up Catherine's letter which had fallen to the floor in the chaos. Just as she predicted. "And what about them?" Olivia asked, gesturing toward the images of Harper, Catherine, and the others. "Are they trapped again?" I studied the photographs carefully. "No," I said finally. "I don't think they're trapped at all. Look at their expressions. I think they've moved on. Whatever held them here, the Wellington Society's experiments, Holloway's chemical formula, has been neutralized. They're just memories now, preserved in silver but no longer bound to a world or any other." Eleanor began methodically collecting the glass shards, her scientist's mind already working on how to explain what had happened, how to document it in terms that wouldn't destroy her academic credibility. "The Wellesley collection will need new display cases," she said matter-of-factly, though her hands trembled slightly. "And a new curator," Olivia added. "I think my family's responsibility is finally complete." As dawn broke, sending shafts of natural sunlight through the museum's windows, we examined the photographs one last time. They remained unchanged, truly static now, their subjects frozen in time as photographs should be. Whatever connection had existed between these silver images and the world beyond our own had been severed. The Wellington Society's great experiment had ended, the breach between worlds sealed. The dark entities that had waited in the darkness between, as Harper had put it, were banished, unable to use the photographs as gateways into our reality. We carefully packed the daguerreotypes into archival boxes, handling them with the reverence due to historical artifacts, but no longer with the fear inspired by supernatural portals. They would be displayed again, eventually, but with proper documentation of their unusual history and the scientific principles that had allowed them to briefly serve as windows to another realm. "There's still so much we don't understand," I said as we locked the storage room. Holloway's original formula, the full extent of the Wellington Society's research. "Some questions are better left unanswered," Olivia replied, her grandmother's journals clutched tightly to her chest. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." That night, As I finally returned to my apartment after days of supernatural crisis, I dreamed of Lieutenant Harper. He stood on a sunlit field, no smoke or battlefield in sight, his uniform clean and his expression peaceful. "Thank you," he said simply. "We couldn't find rest while they used our images as masks. But now we're free." "And the others?" I asked in the dream. "The Dark Ones?" "Return to their own realm," Harper replied. "The breach is sealed on both sides now. They cannot cross over again, not through these pathways, at least." His last words lingered in my mind as I awoke to morning light streaming through my window. Not through these pathways, at least. A week later, Eleanor called to inform me that the Wellesley collection had been secured in the museum's climate-controlled storage facility. The photographs showed no further changes, and the strange cold spots and whispers had disappeared completely from the special collections room. Olivia had begun cataloging her grandmother's journals and papers, preparing them for eventual donation to the historical archive. Among Margaret Wellesley's final notes, she had found a cryptic entry. "The Wellesley family has kept faith. We have watched over the silver windows for generations, documenting the changes, preventing what might come through. But there are other windows, other breaches." The Wellington Society was not the only group to experiment with the boundaries between worlds. Somewhere, others are still opening doors that should remain closed. I filed this information away, hoping we would never need to act on it. But I kept Catherine's formula safe, just in case. Some doors, once discovered, have a way of being opened again and again by those who don't understand what waits on the other side. For now, at least, the photographs of the Wellesley collection rested in peaceful darkness, their subjects finally at peace, the silver barriers between worlds firmly sealed once more. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.